come and join us. I think this is this really echoey, or can you guys hear? I'm not sure how effective this is. Okay. Okay, so if I could ask if everybody could come and take their seats, that would be great. You guys in the back, come on, come and sit. Okay, so the acoustics are slightly wild here. Hi, come and join us. Okay, so the next part of our afternoon, now that we've all emerged from the basement and the depths of the underground, we've got 3 more sessions. We've got the wonderful Kwejo Twenaboa, who's going to tell us all about his work and his campaigning around social housing conditions and more. We will then have 2 further panels that will be introduced as we come to that before we close out the day. I just wanted to remind you all that you can get some water and tea and coffees and things downstairs, but do just, come in and listen, and maybe also we're going to have some space for some questions after we've heard from Kwejo. So thanks all for persisting and staying with us, and yeah, I think there's probably going to be a slew of people coming as the last workshop empties out downstairs, so we'll just, Kavita's on duty there, just like hushing them as they come in. Okay, so thanks everybody. Over to Kwejo Twenaboa, and I think you have to get this quite close.
Oh, for it to, is that all right? Yeah? Thank you. It's really, really good to be here today with you all. So my name's Kwejo Twenaboa, and for anyone that doesn't know of my work, I'm a housing campaigner and has been for the last, nearly 3 years now. Time really has flown. And my sort of backstory is I grew up in social housing. I'm from South London, Mitcham, and my mum, from the moment I was born, lived in social housing. And there was also times at which me and my family were homeless growing up. And a lot of the social housing we had lived in at the time was of really, really poor quality. And that's why I campaign against it now and have done for the last 3 years. So in around 2016 time, we were homeless and we was moved into temporary accommodation, and our options were to either move to Luton, and I'm from London, and I was studying my A-levels, final year at the time. My sister was studying for her GCSEs. She had her exams that same year. So the options were either move to Luton from Mitcham, South London, converted, and we had issues like damp and mold going on to furniture and the beds and the walls, and we had like ant infestations. We had a bathroom that was the size of like a cupboard, like really, really tiny, and we were there. There was nothing temporary about it because we was in there for well over a year before we moved in, or we was offered permanent social. Mice, we had lights that were filled with water, a bathroom which wasn't fit for use, and a kitchen that was nearly 100 years old and infested with woodlice. And we accepted that property, but had been complaining about the conditions that it was in, like a lot of tenants I've learned. But nothing was ever done, and he was diagnosed with cancer, stage 1 esophageal cancer, after about a year of us being there, and that progressed to stage 4 in the space of a year. And he went from walking around to then being fed through his stomach and bedbound because of a tumour in his like throat area, and he couldn't. Funeral, which was February 2020, we had a massive leak and a ceiling caved in, and we had been complaining about it, but no one came out to look at it until October of that same year, so about 8 months later. And then they pulled the ceiling down and didn't tell us it contained asbestos, and there was dust left everywhere. And we thought, okay, it might be a week or two before another ceiling's put back up, but it wasn't until January the following year that a ceiling was put back up, so it was just beams in our living room. It wasn't a living room, nowhere. It was described as not even fit for animals to live in. And well, at the time, I had an with it, so I decided to do the only thing I could at the time and could think of, and that was to take pictures of the inside of my home, embarrassingly, go to social media, post it on there, and hope that we would get the response we did. And I couldn't have expected the response that I did receive. I mean, I was expecting abuse or blame, because that's what you assume, and that's what a lot of tenants assume, and is the reason why they don't really want to speak up about these sorts of issues. But the national news picked it up. I then went around my whole estate and knocked on every single door, went in their homes. And there were situations where people had been living with disrepair for longer than I'd been alive. In one case, it was 27 years, and at the time I was 22 years old. And it was a lady in her 60s who was having to go to B&Q and buy cement and mix it in her kitchen to fill holes because of the mouse infestation in her property, as well as the kitchen and bathroom falling to bits, just because our landlord wouldn't come out and deal with it. I then decided after that I was going to go around the rest of London, and then it spread from there. I had people from all four corners of the country, even Northern Ireland, reaching out saying they're living in the same conditions. Could I help them in the way that I had helped my family by shaming their landlord into doing what is right? And again, in some cases, 10 years, 15 years, they've been living in disrepair. So that was what I decided to do for the last 3 years. I've been working with the likes of Good Morning Britain, BBC, ITV, had a Channel 4 documentary highlighting the conditions people are being forced to live in. And what we've learned is that 3 years ago, I was fighting a sector and trying to convince them that there's a problem here, and they were in denial and saying they're all isolated incidents, that it's not widespread. After 3 years of going around the country and proving actually it's across the country, and we're talking about millions of people living in disrepair or damp and mould. And we had Grenfell, we had the death of Al Bishak, and 6 years on we're still proving that people are living in conditions which can only be described as slum conditions, because they are that bad and not fit for human beings to be living in. And now they're starting to take accountability, but obviously we've got a social housing sector where we haven't got enough homes. We've got 1.25 million people waiting on a social housing list, waiting to get into social housing. Then in the private rented accommodation, every 8 minutes a Section 21 eviction notice is handed to a family in England. So every 8 minutes a family is being evicted from their home. We've got a situation where the homes that we do have is of poor quality, or there's a lot of people that are overcrowded, or there's issues with damp and mould, long lists of disrepair. I've been in homes where I've been stood 2 inches deep in raw sewage, or raw sewage running down people's walls. The list is absolutely endless, and I think it comes back, there's a whole point here about the quality of the homes that we're building, because it's not just old homes that I've been into where it's fallen to bits. I've been to homes that were only constructed and built in 2018 that are falling to bits now. I'm talking balconies rotting on the verge of collapse, these homes with damp and mould, corroded pipes, disrepair, infestations, cockroaches, mice, you name it. And I've made the point that if we think we have a problem with social housing at the moment and we're just going to convince ourselves that it's just old stock, what's going to happen is we're going to construct these homes that we currently are of poor quality, and we're going to knock them up as quickly as possible in order to meet demand and not do a good job. And in 20 years' time, we're going to have an even bigger problem than we have now, where we have all these new builds that have been put up that don't even last 20 years and are to fall into bits. We're going to have to go and knock them back down to rebuild actual quality homes. And it's going to take a lot of money. We already know it's going to take a lot of money to try and meet the existing demand for social housing and housing in general in this country, because of the way in which housing has been neglected by consecutive governments over the last 60 years plus. I think it's fair to say. I think one of my bigger worries at the moment, long-term worries, is the issue of climate change and housing. And I think it's very much a growing issue that we are eventually going to have to address when it comes to housing. I mean, we all saw last year the fact during our summer we had record temperatures. We had hit 40 degrees in some places, and we saw what that had done to some homes burning down, for example, or in the winter when we have extreme weather, we've got flooding in coastal areas and homes being destroyed. These are events that we're going to have to expect will happen more and more frequently as time goes on, especially if we don't address this issue of climate change. But what it means is there's going to be a lot of people displaced from their homes. And it means there's going to be a lot, I don't just mean domestically, I mean on an international level too. There's going to be countries affected by climate change, homes washed away, burnt down. And it's going to mean that we're going to see a lot more migration and people moving from country to country, island to country, different places, both domestically and internationally. And it's going to affect our homes, ultimately. Now, the question is, are we building our homes? Are we preparing for what we could potentially be seeing in the future? Currently, my own thoughts is no. I get complaints on a daily basis about the conditions people are living in. It's my job to go and shame landlords for that. But I'm seeing, especially during summers, a lot of people writing to me, last year in particular, that are worried about the conditions of their homes, not talking about disrepair, but the fact that their homes are overheating, the fact that when we have temperatures that are really, really hot, they are absolutely boiling in their homes, but then in contrast get complaints in winter where people are absolutely freezing in their homes. They've got issues like damp and mold. And it begs the question, are we preparing as quickly as possible to, especially in the next 10 to 15 years now, be constructing homes that takes climate change and the effects of climate change in mind? Or are we going to be constructing these homes which in 10 to 15 years, 20 years from now, is going to be unbearable for people to live in? So absolutely, we're having conversations about the need to build more homes, build quality homes, build homes that are disrepair free, build more temporary accommodation, build more social housing. But are we forgetting about the fact that homes also need to be built in mind for longevity, and the fact that in 20 years' time we could be seeing more and more extreme cases of extreme weather in both the summer and the winter? And are we preparing in building homes that is going to take that in mind and be able to counteract that as best as possible? So that's a bit about what I do, where I started, why I started, but also I think my concerns, climate change is one that perhaps isn't being addressed as much as it should be right now, but definitely something we need to start addressing, because it's going to be, I think when it comes to housing terms, the biggest issue we potentially could be facing. In terms of my sort of future goals and what I want to do sort of short term is push this agenda of housing, the quality of our homes, the need for more housing, more social housing at government level. Like I said, this is an issue and a subject that has been neglected by consecutive governments for 50, 60 plus years. I mean, I remember watching, I don't know if you've seen Kathy Come Home, a documentary from the 60s where people were going through similar to what I'm seeing on a daily basis at grassroots levels in terms of complaints from tenants, damp and mold, those sorts of disrepair issues, and it's been neglected by government. So I'm very much wanting, especially in the run-up to the next election, to get governments to prioritise housing once and for all. It's always something that's further down the list of priorities when it comes to general elections, or they prioritise the wrong things when it comes to housing. But I want them to really address the things that actually matter and are impacting people's lives on a daily basis. And I think we need more and more people calling for that at the next election. So that is my short-term goal, but also to continue applying pressure to local authorities, councils, developers, to make sure the homes that they are building are the right ones and not just being knocked up in order to meet targets or to make profits.
I think this is, oh my God, this is a loud one.
Yeah.
You should have had
like
this
It
one.
has got louder, I think.
You should
Is
have
that one.
that.
That one is louder, yeah.
Oh, we made the wrong mic choice there.
Hopefully you guys could still hear in the back over there.
Do it again.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, and the depth and breadth of the work that you've been doing is unfathomable. I mean, put your hand up if you've seen Kwejo's face on TV, right? We are amongst a star. But there's a kind of a bittersweetness to that, because you were still studying when you started this, weren't you? You kind of completed your studies during this work that you did.
Yeah.
So there's a personal cost to you in taking this work on? I know you don't see it as a cost necessarily because you're so driven and connected to it. But, it wasn't like you were going, sure, what'll I do next with my time? You had a load.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you've come through that. I just wanted to acknowledge that about the way that this weighs on you personally as well, so that people don't think it's grand, we've got Quajo. Like, actually, we need to shore up your resource and your resilience. But the resilience thing was what I wanted to come back to a little bit, because you talked about the impact of climate change, both immediately through the extreme weather changes that we're seeing here, but also on as Indy talked about earlier on, when we talk about a movement of people, it's a very, very real thing. So I just wanted to ask you how you're seeing those impacts. Can we just go a little bit deeper into what you're seeing, and particularly when people talk about retrofit, yes, we're talking about making those homes resilient, but there's a very, very urgent need, isn't there? So you're obviously seeing the impacts of people's homes. Can you talk a little bit about what those experiences are like? And then also we could maybe lead into what promises, because you've been meeting with government as well, and what promises are coming through that do you see there's an urgency to any of those things? So maybe a little bit more about those, help people imagine the impacts of those extreme weather, climate situations that what you're seeing.
Well, in the worst cases, talking about last year where homes were actually burnt down during some of the hottest temperatures on record that we were having, and there was a point actually where it was only a few families that we could do it for, but we were giving out fans to people living in high rises and blocks of flats that were at the very top, because their homes were so hot. Unbearably hot during these temperatures. So you'd think, oh, it's 40 degrees. It was 40 degrees outside, and it felt way hotter in those homes, and people had kids. And we're talking about social housing here. We've got some extremely vulnerable and disadvantaged individuals living in these high rises, and they really were suffering during those temperatures. And that's when the penny dropped for me, because I thought this is going to be happening more and more frequently, and I don't think we've seen the worst. It's going to get worse as each year goes on if we don't tackle this issue of climate change. But then also during winters, when people's homes are being flooded, and the amount of leaks that we're seeing as a result of this, and we're constantly switching on the news during winter and seeing, well, especially when there's storms, in people in coastal areas, their homes and basement homes being flooded and destroyed, and it's happening. It's not just happened once, it's happened over the last few years that they're saying the same things are happening, and those sorts of things are going to be happening more and more frequently. And to some, it's almost like, well, it's not happening to us, so it's fine. But what's going to happen? It's going to happen to more and more people, and I think that the impacts will be devastating. We're talking about people's health and safety. In these cases, and during those extreme sort of weather patterns, especially here, that's when I noticed a lot more DMs and messages, not just asking me about disrepair, but the fact that they're boiling in their homes or they're freezing cold. And I know the government's speaking about insulating homes, and both Labour and Conservative want to have a push on that. But what about during summers and peak temperatures then, or what about the conditions and quality of our homes as years go on? What about the homes that are 60, 70, 80 years old and not built for what it is that we're seeing now in terms of climate? What are we going to do about that? It's going to be, I think, devastating long term if it's not addressed, and it's absolutely going to cost the government a lot too to address if they wait, like they have with a lot of issues when it comes to housing, for it to become a crisis before they deal with it. It's going to cost them a lot more long term, and that's definitely something I'm trying to push and put in front of them to consider, and now before it is a crisis for them.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because what you've described through the case studies and what you've shown, and if anybody follows you on your social media, it's quite a lot to see a case study after a case study after. How many case studies do we need to prove that this is a crisis? And I think that urgency is really, really frustrating to see, exactly at what point Like, how many case studies is enough case studies before we see that urgent action? So when you've been speaking to government, do you feel that that message is helping escalate action, real action that's tangible in the short and long term, or is it just more kicking the can down the road?
Well, I think I know at least that I've put it on the table, so I know they've heard concerns now, whether they just choose to deal with it or not. They've heard about it and it's been put in front of them. For me, I've met politicians regularly and spoken to them about issues with housing and disrepair, and there seems like there is concern there. But whether that translates to real, genuine solutions that's going to impact people's lives, like the everyday person's life for the better, I don't know. I mean, we're going to have to wait and see about that. Or will policies just be created in order to create a strategy that's going to win them an election and sound good to the ears of the everyday people, rather than creating real change. Yeah, real change.
I mean, I think that idea of like showing what's happening, and then the people that you're showing it to maybe I'm generalizing a bit, but can have the luxury to walk away and turn around and say, well, it's not my reality, and so it's not there all the time. It's a crying shame and a scandal, frankly, that it needs to be something that to really resonate should be happening to you. But like, as you said, and to quote like Kay Tempest, the water level's rising, right? So, and I mean that in pressure terms and in everything else. Like, this is, you can't kick this anymore down the line. It has to be dealt with more up front. I don't know how much time we have left, but I wonder if there are any questions from the audience for Kwejo. We've got one there and one there. And may I ask if there are any non-binary folk, women, who would like to also ask a question as well, just to also put that out there. So I'll come here, and then maybe we can encourage some more. Here you go.
Hi, Kwejo. We've been in email or social media contact actually in the past. But when you've addressed some of these problems, did you see a belligerence or an indifference on the social housing providers, or did you think it was a capacity or resource problem they were facing to try and resolve some of these problems?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think, that is a very, very difficult question. I think in terms of resources for councils, that was a lot of the time, and I give both a very, very hard time, local authorities and housing associations. I think more so local authorities said it was a resource and funding sort of issue, compared to some of the housing associations, especially the larger ones that I work with, highlighted. I think, well, in the majority of cases, I'd say the situations get sorted. I mean, when you turn to social media and you highlight a case of someone living in disrepair, especially for 10 years, and you say, you're the housing provider, I've seen evidence that they've been communicating with you, you failed to do your job, basically. There is a response there, but in a lot of cases, what I see is that same response isn't there before I get involved. And that lack of care and urgency isn't there before I get involved. And we talk about funding and resources, and this is where I'm sort of critical and harsh with local authorities, because a big problem here, especially with the state people are living in, comes down to attitudes and lack of care. And fundamentally, that doesn't cost anything, I think, especially from members of staff. Having compassion, care, empathy for those living in social housing, and removing that stigma doesn't cost anything. And for me, that is the foundation of any or should be the foundation of any housing provider, is fundamentally to have that. Because if we flip this to the NHS, and there were situations where patients were being neglected in the same way that some of the cases I've been highlighting, or they didn't have the same lack of compassion for their patients, or empathy, there would be absolutely outrage, I think. But what I see is the systemic problem is that lack of compassion and empathy and care when it comes to these certain individual situations. There's a lot of people that work in housing that just aren't able to connect with social housing tenants. You look at the boards of some of these housing associations, and you look across, and there's sort of no diversity, there's no class diversity. You ask them, have you lived in social housing? No. When last did you go onto a estate to visit social housing tenants? And I'm not speaking for all, but I'm talking especially about the big ones. There's a huge disconnect between those at the top and those that they're providing their service to, and I think that's where it fails. But absolutely, I mean, local authorities need more funding. They need more funding to build homes. They need more funding to continue functioning and making sure these situations aren't happening. But two, I do think there's a question there about the efficiency and money management within local authorities and housing associations, but I think the public sector too. But that's not an excuse. The answer is we need more funding from government and resources in order to make sure this sort of thing isn't happening. But again, attitudes and the way in which we're treating people costs absolutely nothing.
Thank you for that. I'm looking around. Do we have... Yeah, Melissa, I'll come to you. We'll have this last one, and then I think maybe... I don't know how tight the clock is, but let's come to you, Melissa.
So I've worked on a couple of retrofit projects for the Social Housing Decarbonization Fund, which does work simply in the social housing sector. So I know there is a little bit of work being done there. I agree there's not nearly enough funding. So at the moment, it's just targeting certain of the worst off that can be organized well, right? So there's a lot of kind of input about how well can the project be project managed, you know, and how many can be done at one time and that sort of thing. So there's gonna be a lot of gaps in that. Yeah. But I'm even more worried about the fact that now that the stick has been taken away from private landlords, I think the number is something like 4.6 million private rentals in the UK. And something like 40% of those landlords don't have a single property with an EPC above a D. So we've got a huge problem with private rental, which, as you know, often has low income tenants as well. And there's nothing for them. There's at least a moral obligation on the part of the councils, but there's nothing addressing the private renter sector at all. I'd love to know if you know of anything different, or if you agree with me that it's just a huge gap.
I mean, we've got a problem we have got a massive problem, a huge problem in social housing, and I've been sort of on the receiving end of that. But what's undeniable is the scale of problem within the private sector. Exactly with what you've explained, and so many other situations, like, for example, we've had the social housing bill, where the renters reform bill is, we have no clue at the moment, in terms of councils too and their sort of obligation. I think it's sort of, it's the current way it works is really flawed, because at the moment what government is expecting is for local authorities to be able to support themselves, but also be doing X, Y, and Z in the private rented sector too. When we know how stretched they are, we know what's happened to council budgets over the last 13 years and beyond, and it's going to be completely impossible for them to meet the scale of demand that is there at the moment. And it's sort of these big issues, I think, that fall on the doorstep of government that they need to address, because there's no, it's beyond a degree, or it's just sheer common sense. Like, we cannot be expecting councils that are already struggling to then go and work miracles in the private sector and do things that they can't. And what that means is that there's people in the private sector that are left to suffer and sort of ignored. But we have got a major issue in across the private sector, across housing and the rented sector in general, I think. But we have got far more homes, private rented accommodation, than we do social housing across the country. So we can expect a much bigger level of problem there. But it's absolutely true what you said. I don't think enough has been done or is being done in the private sector to address the same issues that we're seeing in social housing, but some of it, there's more of a spotlight on those issues when it comes to social housing, if that makes sense. So I completely agree.
I think, are we at the end of this session slot? What I would like to do is ask you if there are things that I mean, you're doing a lot of heavy lifting. So have you got a request or an ask of the audience in terms of how we can support what you do or support things similar to this, so we're not all going here? Like, it's all on your shoulders.
Yeah.
But is there an ask that you might have of us as a community of people?
Yeah, I think as individuals, I think the most important thing is to be able to have these conversations and continue these conversations and have these conversations with as many people as possible, because like the work that I do and the stigma that comes along with a lot of it, and it's the same sorts of things happen in the private rented sector in terms of conditions too. People feel often embarrassed or ashamed to openly have these conversations, especially if they're going through it. And I think what needs to happen is safe spaces created where we have dialogue and discussions without that stigma or judgment coming along, because that's the biggest fear for people going through it. I also think we need to be having more and more conversations about the real issues within housing, especially in the run-up to the election, and be able to sort of reflect on what it is that you're seeing and what it is that's being promised by governments, especially in relation to housing and their manifestos, because it will be coming out. Are they promising things that's genuinely going to impact the lives of everyday people that are really struggling, especially in rented accommodation at the moment? Or are they dangling a shiny carrot in front of our noses in order to win themselves an election? Ultimately, I think we need to be able to reflect on that and stand back and look and actually think, well, is this going to deal with the issues that we know are happening because it's impacting our lives and people that we know? Or is this another sort of facade that we're being promised? We need to be asking those questions of our politicians, the people that ultimately come round every 5 years begging for our votes, right? I think that's what I could ask from you guys. And yeah, just keep this conversation of housing at the top of not just your agenda, but pushing it to be the top of the agenda for our local politicians, for our government, and in the media too, because that's how we continue this conversation going. Housing's been neglected, like I said, for generations, longer than I've been alive, my mum's been alive, and it's about time it was treated with the sort of urgency that it needs. We cannot fix other social issues within society unless we fix housing, and a prime example is we can't fix healthcare, we cannot fix education. Look at crime, look at poverty. It all links back to housing and the ability to have a safe and decent home over our head. And until we get that right, how can we possibly expect to fix the other sort of issues within society too?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Round of applause for Quajo. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to move along to our next panel discussion, where I think I can see Cameron and Sam and some others. So stick with us, and thanks again.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Very loud. It is. Yeah.
Is it possible to have low chairs instead of the high ones? I don't like.
Even with technology, some of you will know we're not in a building or a venue that we run normally, so we're just sort of working around everything. And
I think our sound went straight into your room downstairs,
that was
so
fun,
we were
yeah.
playing videos going, I can't hear anything.
Yeah.
Next door had it in full surround sound.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, if you are in the gallery area, could you be here to listen to the talks? If you're really fancying a conversation, if you move on beyond here onto the platform, or you can go downstairs, or you can head out to the Crescent. But if you're in here, can you be focused on, as much as possible, the acoustics for the talks? If you're wondering, are there seats? There's seats everywhere. Do come over and sit down. And Sarah and I wanted to really just welcome everybody who joined us for the afternoon. Say hello to people who've been here all day. And thank you so much for all of the care and hosting energy and singing and deliberating and flares that you set off out there, which definitely caused a little bit of a drama in here. It's been a really wonderful day so far. And for those of you joined in the afternoon, we're just going to give you a little bit of an update as to like what's been happening. And if some of the lovely Civic Square team could help people who are chatting in this space to find a space where they can chat really easily, the building's all ours, that'd be wonderful. So we've had quite the morning.
We have. It has been a morning and an afternoon, and I'm not really sure what time it is. It was a surprise to emerge from the basement, and there was daylight. We weren't quite sure what had happened. So the morning, who was here this morning? Can I see a show of hands who's here? Oh my Lord, look at you heroes, still here, still
and
standing.
Who's joining that sort of later in the day? Okay, that's pretty good.
Excellent.
Okay, so that's cool. If you're joining later in the day, let's tell you a little bit about why we're here. You'll know we're on the second stop of a 5 and a bit stop tour across England, Scotland and Wales, building on Retrofit Reimagined 22, which really started to unpack what happens when we think about the transformative potential of the scale of challenges we face and the scale of opportunity that things like Retrofit provide as a site of imagination and transformation. And we had quite a profound keynote panel. It was fairly long, but it was kind of designed on purpose. We recorded a lot of it so that there's a real sort of space that can go through the festival. We showed everybody a little bit about the last site we'd been at in Moseley Road Bath in Balsall Heath. You might have read their story in the gallery, which is very much focused on what happens when the incredible, eclectic, highly convivial, skilled inner city neighbourhood of Balsall Heath, galvanised by Zero Carbon House and many, many local community organisations started to think about what happens when their neighbourhood is in the forefront of the climate transition and retrofit of their neighbourhoods. And I shared a little bit about Civic Square and what brought us here. And the day so far has really looked at what it means to expand our sense of what are the ways into retrofit, what are the entanglements around land, materials, people. If you weren't here this morning, I'd thoroughly recommend just watching back some of that morning in chunks, because what I was really astounded by was that a lot of heavy stuff came out. Really complex, quite big picture ideas about and challenges around our material economy, around the scale of the challenge, around the scale of the opportunity. But there was a real kind of healthy interaction amongst the panel, how they came to it from so many different angles, from healing justice angle, from an angle of large-scale global projects, from an education angle. And we went on into a scale of an afternoon of provocations around land, material and people where, I mean, I don't know about yours, but mine was full of energy and interconnections across people working in the commons, working with skills, in community land trusts, in retrofit, all starting to find what Ted, who was in there, talked about was this real common ground where their movements and their work met. And that was a really interesting moment for us. How was it in your people panel?
It was really great. I'm just going to do something. I'm just going to check in a little minute because it was a really high energy day, and I think we still have a way to go. And yesterday I was at AJ Retrofit Live, and I just by the end of the day needed to just say I had felt an anxiety rising. I just needed to check in with everybody else in the room and see if everyone's okay. And I'm going to just do that and say, how are you all feeling? Because I need a deep breath. To do that, and I also want to take, just to reiterate, I can see some people glancing over your shoulders in the back because you're maybe straining to have to hear us, and I'd just like to invite anybody in the gallery to do please come and join us, or maybe take your conversation out that way, because I think I can see you, some of you glancing. So if you wouldn't mind and you're in the gallery, please do come and join us, or there's some comfy seats outside or everywhere. To return to the people provocation, we got a bit physical in the space. We just moved the chairs around. We just brought them into a circle, and we started to talk about how those big interconnected issues that we were dealing with this morning, how they land on the ground. And I was reflecting, I met somebody as we were transitioning from the big ideas morning into the afternoon panels, and she was saying, I get these big ideas and I feel them, but I don't know how I translate that at home on the ground to my community, because some of this is like not accessible. And how do we apply what we know to be those big issues? How do we apply what we feel are collective resolves or solutions or ways of working together? And I really wish that she had been able to stay for the people provocation, because we heard from people who were on the ground doing those projects, you know, from Thule and the Light Fantastic, through the work with Power Up North London, to the work that Living Places are doing. And these are people who are like, okay, I hear that, and I am going to try and translate that into stuff on the ground. And so it was actually really heartening and really quite positive, full of like kind of a connected energy. So that was a real gift, I feel, like for the day. And I love as well the change and shift and gear that we had just listening to Quajo, who I just have endless respect and energy for. He's still here. We love you. And I just want to, like, you know, welcome us all to, like, if we need those breaths and to take them, but to stay, because this work is so important, and it's so important for us to be able to, like, take it into our hearts and recognize that it is big and it's heavy, but it's possible to work through it. So thank you for my little personal debrief.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And we've got 2 final panels to end the day, which are just magical. And we change and shift tone again this afternoon, this early evening. And as a reminder, for all of you feeling that pent up, like, how do we put this into practice? How do we remember this is the most institutional and intentionally institutional part of Retrofit Reimagined. The rest of the festival is in Balsall Heath, in Ladywood, in Knoll West, in Glasgow, in
the
places.
magical wonderland of Wales at Cat.
Yes,
Come there, take your shoes off, breathe in the clean air.
Absolutely. This is where, and it's all purposely decentered around decentering the big theoretical ideas and looking at how people are working on the ground, demonstrating tomorrow, today, rehearsing those futures, building the infrastructures that we know we need. So remember, this is like one little taste of it, and it was intentional to occupy the space. So I'm going to be really honest, it's not a place that these ideas are often really valued and uplifted, and it was so this is intentional. So if you're feeling that, like, do come and talk to me, and remember what I said this morning. There's an Access Fund card. If there are people in your community, in your neighborhood, in your knitting group, in your local retrofit project, in your activism, in your soup kitchen, in your anything that you think, God, a weekend surrounded by people doing practical action, people imagining, people would be really amazing, or people need to hear about this, come tell us. We've still got 3 sites, and it's really about continuing to build and co-build the festival as we go. So on that note, I'm going to pause here and hand you over to somebody I have immense love and respect for, Scott Macaulay from the Anthropocene Architecture School, who's going to take you on a little journey and then host a wonderful panel doing incredible work. Thank you, Scott.
Absolute pleasure. So thank you very, very much for having me. So to kind of preface what I'm going to talk about is that when it comes to technical solutions for retrofit, we have nailed it. We can do everything we need to. You've seen incredible things all day. But at the same time, what's holding that back is not a lack of solutions, it's a lack of political action. It's a lack of a political will to put lives before profit. So we're going to go through what the built environment and housing look like during a climate crisis. And then we're going to welcome our panel, and we're going to be talking about resistance and mobilization, and also building generative infrastructures. So we do need incredible resistance to the practices taking place, because I'm going to say something controversial. Our housing system is not broken. It was designed to work that way, and it's working incredibly effectively. It is literally killing people. So that is the preface. There's everything we need to do can be done and would transform the lives of millions of people if we did it with care at the center. But the thing is, we live in a profound culture of uncare where it's totally normal to disregard the well-being of the environment and of other people. So does the clicker work? We've now found out. Yes, it does. So to kind of open up, there's this one quote from Naomi Klein I've not been able to erase from my brain for about 5 years. So it just so happens that we are all alive at the last possible moment when changing course can mean saving lives on a truly unimaginable scale. So again, this is not just about budgets, this is not just about carbon, this is about lives and us playing our part globally and putting climate justice at the heart of it, because we've already overshot our fair share. So, oh, we've gone the wrong way. We're off to a good start. So, oh, we've gone really far. Shit. Okay, so now this is my I am very qualified slide. So my name is Scott, I use he and they. I run the Anthropocene Architecture School and practice for a company called Archetype. I work typically in built environment. I've taught at 20 plus universities from UC Berkeley to Toronto. I've taught people in Australia, and I've taught over 100 times. I've also worked on over a dozen life cycle analysis projects. I do the embodied carbon stuff that should be normal but still isn't, and kind of retrofit. But my kind of why of what got me into this was not our education system, because our education system is fundamentally failing future practitioners. So these images are where I got my true education, so on construction sites with people getting their hands dirty, doing the work of building sustainable buildings. I helped to found ACAN Scotland. I'm a co-producer of Scotland's Architecture Fringe, and I'm an active member of Living Rent. So Living Rent are Scotland's tenants union, and I do lots of kind of logistical support around retrofit and buildings for that. So my practice is quite broad and varied, but it's all about taking the climate crisis seriously at every single stage. So just to give you, I'm actually qualified and to quell the fears of people in traditional construction. So this is what my kind of work tends to look like. I create spaces for people to take climate change seriously and to teach our future practitioners, our local communities, our tenants unions, our local authorities occasionally, that the house is on fire. And if we don't act like that, we are not going to hit any of the targets we need to, because our targets are lackluster and a bit shy anyway. So from the top kind of left-hand side, I founded the Anthropocene Architecture School as a provocation at Scotland's Architecture Fringe, and since have kind of taught and lectured over 100 times kind of internationally. And that's hosting workshops, everything from slightly traditional studios where you've stripped out the toxic culture of architecture school, to requesting the consent of residents currently fighting off demolition. So the bottom left-hand side was when some students from the University of Sheffield came to see the Windford Towers in Glasgow that Scotland's biggest social landlord wants to demolish, because their track record is demolishing 17,000 homes and building 3,000. So they're not really a social landlord. The middle was unlearning powerlessness. So a big part of my work is we're not going to hit our climate targets by just learning new things. Our culture has embedded very toxic, extractive, oppressive, supremacist practices that we need to unlearn if we are going to do this equitably. So this was just the kind of closing panel. So Tom is in the room, but I won't point and embarrass him. We had Phoebe Plummer from Just Stop Oil, who wasn't allowed to be in the room because art galleries were in their bail conditions. Morgan Troland, who is an structural engineer currently who's held as a political prisoner, dialed in from his current place of residence. And we also had representation from UVW SAW, from ASCA, and It's Freezing in LA from Martha as well. And then in the I Am Qualified, I Promise, I was also asked to go to the EU to talk during European Sustainable Energy Week about architecture for a just transition. So I've done the traditional-ish stuff, and I do the stuff about moving us along as fast as possible as well. Is that going to work? But at the same time, we cannot talk about housing without talking about climate. So this was part of COP26, where many people in the room perhaps came to my home city as the COP process turned it into a greenwash circus for 2 weeks. So this was part of a demand from Living Rent to tie rent controls to energy efficiency, because all of the policy things we are being offered are simply not good enough. And lots of them have been scrapped as well, so we're actually not moving forwards at a time when we urgently have to. But this is just lots of the biggest wins in my home country have been from collectivized action and union organizing. So if we are going to tackle the housing crisis, it's not going to come from government. There's nobody coming to save us. We have seen that this week. We've seen Rosebank given the go-ahead, which is an act of ecocide, of intergenerational violence, and of climate colonialism. So we can't mince our words about this. We have to be honest about what is happening. So I am not going to soften what I say. I will be polite as I say it if I try, but I'm not going to dodge that bullet in the slightest. So this was just the end of a big part of my work is about unlearning. So that the idea of unlearning these systems, practices, socialized norms that we are perpetuating an economic system that sacrifices land, lives, and communities for the continuation of a small number of people to make profit. So this was everything from getting students to build things, to playing a ridiculously large board game, to the panel that you can see as well. So that's just a little bit of this is what the work I do looks like. But to bring it back, Dr. Sally Wintrobe described where we are we're within a culture of uncare. So neoliberalism has hollowed out our care and compassion for one another. And this impacts policy, politics, everything at every single level of how industry works. So every time probably the best way I can describe it is an example of I was walking home from work in Glasgow, and everyone was walking past someone on the street begging, but when someone who wasn't homeless fell over, 12 people ran to their aid. So we are socially conditioned to not care and to normalize that and to suppress that as part of the cognitive dissonance around climate change. So this culture of uncare manifests in the built environment more powerfully than any other example I can use. So we'll just get stuck into that if the clicker plays ball. So we saw last winter over 11,000 people died due to fuel poverty. Fuel poverty is not an inevitable outcome of housing. It's an inevitable outcome of a housing system that's putting profit before maintaining homes. So in our housing system, there is no legal minimum to proactively survey and to make sure homes are actually energy efficient. They've actually scrapped loads of the impending obligations on landlords to change this. So 11,000 people died, and our country continued on as if that did not happen. There was no emergency meeting in Parliament. There was not mass shutdowns of cities. That is this is our culture. These things happen, and we split them into a part of our head and we don't think about them. But this is something that if we're going to achieve the kind of transformations that we need to unlearn that cognitive dissonance and to look at this for what it is. Because every time I tried to write this talk this week, Rishi Sunak did something fucking mental. So this is number one. So Rishi Sunak decided that on the same day as he was going to cut inheritance tax, he was going to disband our energy efficiency task force that was 6 months old. Our political system allowed an unelected millionaire to disband our energy efficiency task force with no checks, no balances, no voting at all. That can happen because our political system does not have care at its heart and soul. Neither does our housing system. So this is number one of the things that happened whilst I tried to write this presentation. Right, and we got the next one. At the same time, so before they got even worse, it was calculated that the Great British Insulation Scheme was going to take 300 years to do its job. That is why is that acceptable? This was put forward to government, and there was not massive challenge from the opposition, who failed to be an opposition. But this is the level of ambition of our government to take care of its citizens during a climate crisis currently killing people in other countries. This is a culture of uncare, because if it's put forward it takes 300 years, this is alongside a net zero strategy that was successfully taken to court for being inadequate. So not only is our net zero strategy so bad it fails in a court of law, it would take 300 years of the bar being on the floor for us to actually hit any targets. And those targets are not good enough. And then we move on to the next one. So we were going to have targets for landlords. And we talked, the private rental sector came up. So in our culture of uncare, it's been welcomed, there's been a rollback of installation, kind of obligations of landlords. So it's been calculated in the next 10 years, everyone here who's renting, collectively as a country, we're going to pay 8 to 10 billion pounds more in heating bills. Again, this is to benefit landlords. This is neoliberal capitalism shaping our housing system. Housing system ain't broke, it's working as intended. Again, this is a culture of uncare. But just to prefix, in that culture, in the construction industry, we care about quite selective things. So lots of the industry turned up as allies to protect this Marks and Spencer's building from being demolished. And that's a good thing, but that's very, very, very rare. So on the right-hand side, we have the Windford Towers. 600 social homes that could be very easily retrofitted are going to be demolished. But they're not going to be demolished in the way you might be used to them. These are all going to be blown up, and are all full of asbestos and other chemicals that have not been disclosed. So in today's culture, that is seen as regeneration. Again, the cognitive dissonance in our heads, we see that and we put that somewhere else. And then we go about our day, our 9 to 5, and we just ignore that this is an environmental crime. And also, the housing lists in Glasgow are into tens of thousands. Thousands of people need a home, and yet it's been given planning permission to blow up 600 of them. And that's only one estate with things about to be blown up on it. And there's no outrage from the architectural press. We get a couple of articles when they feel generous to us. But where is the construction industry standing up for people's homes and actually taking action to say this is not ethically acceptable? It's non-existent. So I put out a bit of an invitation to the Scottish construction industry and said, please turn up for us because we need you. Nobody turned up. The speakers turned up. Nobody else turned up. We had three of us from ACAN Scotland and some speakers. So there's a huge level of cognitive dissonance between people who will proudly proclaim that they are all for retrofit and turning up on the streets to getting in the way of demolition equipment to say, this cannot happen. We are in a culture of profound and deeply disturbing uncare. This will get good towards the end, I promise. So it's also been worked out the impact this housing system has on the NHS. So we basically pay about 40% of all the money we spend on healthcare comes from our buildings. But £1.4 billion is directly attributable to poor housing. And it's been calculated that if we were to do all the retrofit we need to do, it would pay for itself in 1 year. So that's on the table. Our government know this. There's nothing about this in the political conversation. We have the solutions. We know what's doing us harm. We know that people are vulnerable. We know there is a climate crisis. But we're ignoring that if we retrofitted all the homes we need to retrofit overnight, which is physically impossible, but just theoretically, it would pay for itself in 1 year. Your politicians could make this happen if they cared, if they were not lobbied excessively and were just doing things for people to make profit. But this is the level of the solution we have in retrofit. We could be radically reducing the strain on the NHS if we were to take retrofit seriously, but politically, we're not in the slightest. So 8% is a pretty big number. So 8% of homes in England were affected by fire concerns, all brought to light by the Grenfell Tower disaster. Grenfell is not an anomaly. It is simply what happens when our system of profound uncare results in when everything lines up for a tragedy to happen. There are dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of blocks of flats around the country where this could happen again, and it's being overlooked. And again, cognitive dissonance. When was the last emergency housing meeting to strip flammable cladding off of buildings? There hasn't been one. We don't have a national programme for getting this done at speed. So 8% of homes in the UK. So you might wonder, what does that look like graphically? So every single square on the screen represents 20,000 flats that were, these had fire concerns. But we can now, if we move along, we can see what the legacy of a conservative and neoliberal government is. So we have had, of those 2.3 million flats, 342,000 are still known as dangerous. Nothing is happening to speed this up. So 342,000 flats, that is 635,000 people whose daily existence is stressed, is worried, is concerned. They know that they live in a fire risk, and our government is not coming to help them. And then we look at how many they fixed. So we had 4.2 million problems, right? Well, 2.3 number. We fixed 32,000. We have had years, half a decade, to start fixing this problem, and the government simply has not tried. But again, where is the opposition? When was the last time an opposition party stood up and demanded that we need justice for Grenfell now? We need justice for every single person at risk in a building that is a fire risk now. I don't see hands. So this is where we are. This is what our construction industry and housing system looks like. It's not comfortable, and I fully appreciate that. But this is what we need to look at if we're going to talk about the scale of transformation that we need to see. So there was an incredible book written about this. So Peter Apps is a journalist from Inside Housing who wrote a book titled after what a government official is. We'll say alleged because it was multiple times. The book is called Show Me the Bodies. So I'll just read you a quick passage. The world is getting hotter. Hot summer days provide perfect conditions for fires. There will be more to come. And despite everything we have seen and all the suffering at Grenfell Tower, it remains entirely possible that we will once more witness the terrifying sight of a building consumed by fire with people trapped inside. Government officials are alleged to have said, "Show me the bodies." They have seen them now, and still we have not changed. That is what our housing system looks like. That is the harsh reality of where we are, and we have every right to be absolutely outraged. Because not one of our neighbours deserves to be treated like this. Not one person, one living soul deserves to be treated like this. And this is where we are. This is the truth we need to look at. This is the cognitive dissonance we need to address. Because if we don't, it's not going to change. We are getting incremental solutions for a fatal problem. You don't incrementally treat something that is terminal. That is where we are. And again, when we look at the kind of predictions for climate change and how much the world is going to heat up, people born today are going to see a radically different future than the one everyone in this room saw when they grew up. It's going to get significantly hotter, but it's all about what we do now. Every action we take today is a fraction of a degree that is not killing someone else somewhere else in the world. It's a tornado that is not as strong. It is flood, it's tidal, it's the coastline taking longer to move, so we have time to prepare. If we do not do things now, things are going to get significantly worse. But we have known this for decades. This is the IPCC's report, and we know that if we don't do anything right now, things are going to get significantly worse. And just to kind of probably paraphrase, everyone's probably heard the 40% numbers, but 39% of all of the carbon emitted as a planet comes from the construction industry and the operation of buildings. 39%. And 1/3 of all the energy that we use as a civilization is used in buildings. We also know that 40 to 70% of all the energy we use as a civilization is wasted through inefficient energy systems. So we have the capacity to reduce that 1/3 by 40 to 70%, and governments are not enacting it, even though we have the solutions. Profound culture of uncare. But just to stress the positive impact that people working in the built environment can actually have. So on this far left-hand side, if I'm reading it properly, the embodied carbon of a large project is about 2,500 tonnes. So that's 196 times bigger than the impact of us as citizens in the UK. But we also need to recognise the climate justice element of this. So in the UK, our carbon footprint is 6 times what the IPCC has recommended for us to stay below 1.5 degrees. We are overshooting that by 6 times on average. But just to point out for fun, there is not enough space on this screen to show the carbon impact of one billionaire. And their impact is over 1 million times bigger than the average person globally. So we need to start talking about wealth taxes, we need to start talking about tax, we need to start talking about closing tax havens, UBI, and we need to talk about the impacts that we have in the workplace. So again, without this, we are not going to move very fast. But we're going to get to a happier occasion. So this is part of my why. So when I was in architecture school in 2016, I was not being taught to design sustainable buildings. But I was really lucky. So you might have seen Alex Barrow, who might still be in the room. Alex was teaching how to build hempcrete buildings, so I went to learn with Alex, and there was no projects in Scotland, so I couldn't learn in my own country. Alex had a project with a couple doing a self-build in Le Contamino Montjoly in the French Alps, so I got to learn on this regenerative and incredibly non-hierarchical construction site, where I got to learn from environmental engineers, people who've been doing lime plastering in their family for 400 years, and from people who are doing incredible things, but also seeing what is possible when you care. How you can organize construction, how you can build things, how every single person has something they can share with someone else. But I'm also going to use this as an opportunity to invite every single person in this room who works around buildings. I want you to start thinking back to the very first building you were ever involved with, and to start thinking, what size was that building? Because the impact we have as individuals is important and we cannot overlook. So something that Morgan, who is currently in prison at the moment, Morgan Troland, told me was one of the things that pushed him into taking direct action was sitting back and calculating how big an impact had his work as a structural engineer had on the climate crisis. So in honour of Morgan, I've decided to calculate the entire square meterage of every single building I've ever worked on in the past 5 to 7 years. I have no idea, the time blurs. So from where we are sitting right now, you have to walk 1/2 kilometre in every single direction to get outside of the square meterage I've worked on as one person. I am one person in the construction industry, and I've worked on 0.23 kilometres of buildings. So I do work in the life cycle analysis, so I am part of the damage control that makes those not so bad. But every single person in construction should sit for just 5 minutes and try to think about how much have you built. And I'm not saying this is a guilt thing, I'm saying this about mobilization, I'm saying this about caring. Just to sit and be really honest with yourself. Am I making the problem worse in my current stream of work? And how can I change that? If I cannot change that, should I change course and should I change the place of work? Or we can go to, should I unionize with my colleagues and withdraw our consent from doing that project? Because that's something that all of us working in the sector can do. We need to withdraw our consent from doing harm. And then we've got more fun ones. So on the left-hand side, all of those circles, the lower those numbers are, the more energy efficient the building is. So this includes getting up and running around. So the passive house standard is on this side. So just for kind of communication's sake, we're just going to call these units. So the more units that this building has, the less energy efficient it is. So passive house was developed in the 90s in Germany and is 15 units. So for 30 years in Germany, they've been building incredibly efficient homes. So the typical new build home in the UK is between 80 and 90. So we are 30 years behind the curve of what we could be doing. And that's in our policy, that's in regulations. We are doing avoidable harm every single time we build a new home, and we have been for 30 years. That is the reality of our construction industry and the sector, and it's very hard to sit with, especially if you've worked in construction. It is very difficult, but it's something that we need to sit with that discomfort and lean into that if we are going to move forwards. Big numbers again, 50,000. So we've got a growing and relentlessly growing appetite for demolition in the UK. Every year we demolish 50,000 buildings. That translates to 1 every 10 minutes. So in the time that I've been speaking to you, we've hypothetically lost 2 buildings that could have been retrofitted and people could be living in. And again, this is through all manner of reasons, but at the same time, if you're putting the environmental goods of a planet before profit, this number would not be so high. Then we move on again, and 1%. Why have I said 1%? I said 1% because of every single material that we put into a building in Northwest Europe, we recycle 1% of it. So 99% of that 50,000 number goes into landfill. That's, again, a culture of profound and disturbing uncare. We waste 99% of what we put in buildings. There's been no emergency debates in the EU about this. There's been no emergency debates in Westminster. Surprise, a fucking prize. But at the same time, we know how to do this. We've been building buildings since thousands of years ago, and they've been lasting hundreds of years. Why do buildings only last 30 years now? Neoliberal capitalism. It's the elephant in the room we've not talked about yet. And then we come to the one slide I really want everyone to remember, because this is significantly important when we talk about justice. So when we get to 2026, the EU 27 and UK construction sector has used up its 1.5 degrees carbon budget. So in less than 1,000 days, we've used up our fair share of carbon for the world to stay below 1.5 degrees. To say this in very, very, very blunt terms, everything we do beyond that is essentially we are reenacting colonialism on other countries. We are taking their fair share. And again, this has not been, it's not the headlines of any construction magazine, no architectural journals, there's no panic. But our carbon budget for doing what is fair and what is just is going to disappear in 1,000 days, in less than 1,000 days. And we're going to surpass the 2 degree by 2030. So all of this net zero by 2050 is pie in the sky and ridiculous, because what we need to do now, or we are taking from other countries who are not, they are not underdeveloped countries, they are post-colonial countries. This is a legacy of imperialism, and it's a legacy of white supremacy. And we need to talk to that now. We cannot ignore this. So if you work in construction, please take this to anyone above, and if you're in an industry, if you get no positive response from your bosses, please unionize, because we need more people saying no to building more when we should be retrofitting things. It saves between 50 and 75% of the carbon to retrofit than to build anew. We've known this for decades. So we need to stop. And what does a construction housing sector look like in the UK if we do this? It looks like stewardship. It looks like using our imaginations within a budget. It looks like care. It looks like compassion. So we are going to surpass that budget on our current course by 2026. And again, this is no headline. So I would please invite everyone to make a lot of noise to everyone doing buildings around you and people you're working with, because this one is incredibly important. And just a little bit of kind of, when you work in construction or you're working otherwise, what makes kind of shifting behavior is difficult. We need to recognize that. It does not happen overnight. It takes lots of different things because there are lots of factors that influence the decisions people make. One thing we can change is how we present information. So festivals like this, which make it open invitations to learn, to share, we need more of these. But we can also create the kind of conducive environments and infrastructures to have these conversations. It need not be in the building centre, it could be on your street, in your neighbourhood, in your library, in a local cinema, it could be absolutely anywhere, but we need conversations. But also we need new norms. We need to normalise resistance to a culture of uncare that is killing people. And we'll talk about that more with our fantastic panel soon. But what does retrofit look like in terms of storytelling? So back where I'm from in Glasgow, there was an incredibly good retrofit carried out on a multi-storey block of flats dated from the 60s. So they've developed a methodology where nobody has to be decanted whatsoever. This can happen without disrupting anyone's lives. And a man did not have to turn his heating on for 2 years. Now, I want to invite the room to imagine what your life would be like if you had not been worrying about your heating bill for 2 years. All of that stress, all of those worries, all of those deciding, is it cold enough yet? Shall I put on another jumper? All of that can be addressed through retrofitting homes. And again, we have all the solutions. We know what we're doing. Anyone who tells you we don't know what we're doing has an agenda, and that agenda likely coincides with oil and gas. So I've timed this well and remembered my slides. So Barnabas Calder is an architectural historian who corrected the age-old term form follows function, because it absolutely does not. Form follows power. So our buildings are not, that phrase of Winston Churchill's, that we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. No, we don't. That is pacification at its bluntest. Buildings are shaped by building regulations, by power, by speculative investment, by culture, by available infrastructure, which we'll get to soon as well, but also by developing in a country in the UK where cheap oil has been available for decades. We have not built homes to the standards they could be. We have allowed things to be built that need not be. And we now have an oil field which is an active open ecocide and is a crime against humanity. The Rosebank oil field is a crime. And to call it anything less is to be dishonest with ourselves and the people it's going to harm. So the infrastructure we build affects the housing we build as well. So form-following fuel means that because we've been using this cheap oil, your home is inefficient. Your home has not been looked after. You might have noticed molds and other problems, and one of the reasons this has been happening, cheap oil and cheap energy has allowed us to make inefficient buildings comfortable. When you make that expensive, living in an inefficient building is expensive. It's not comfortable anymore. That has been an illusion. And because of we're seeing energy companies raising profits and the massive multi-billion profits made by the likes of Shell and BP at the expense of people's lives. Remember, 11,000 people in the UK died because of cold homes last year, over winter. So people died and they made billions of pounds of profits, and their windfall taxes are not enough. We need significantly more. But we got some good news. So you might have heard lots of reports coming out about how many jobs would retrofit create. So these have been done within the confines of an imagination that looks at what we do today. So we're very, very fortunate. The Passive House Trust decided to look at the numbers in relation to what we need to do, not what we think is possible within our current economic system. So in 2020, we needed to retrofit one home every 35 seconds. And if we want to hit that net zero target, we need to employ 2 million people. For context, that's half the size of the NHS. Oh yeah, I'll speed this up. So I'll get on to the last slide. So 2 million people at NHS. And to put this into context, this is a slide I'd also like everyone to remember. So there are 26,000 people directly employed by oil and gas in the UK. 26,000. For every one job in oil and gas, there are 3 jobs in clean energy. And that's quite good. For every one job in oil and gas, there are 77 jobs just in domestic retrofit that need to be done. So there's millions of people needing to be employed. And for context, those figures are now 3 years out of date. And we're in a worse situation today than we were when this was done. So I think I have just wrapped up. So as a kind of open invitation, as our lovely panelists join me, apologies if I lost track of time, my time blindness is quite bad. But in their book, The Dispossessed, Ursula K. Le Guin's character Shevik says, you cannot buy the revolution, so we cannot just buy that perfect insulation or heat pump. You cannot make the revolution, so you can't kind of design it. You can only be the revolution. It is in your spirit, or it is nowhere. And this is an open invitation to, once we've kind of had a chat, we're going to start inviting you to take part. Instead of a Q&A, we're going to do invitations to action. So if I could be joined by our panel, and we will get things rolling in that regard as well. But thank you very much for pairing with me.
Great.
Right, so just to kick off, I'm just going to pass the mic along and just introduce yourself to kind of, and also your why. What made you take the action you do? So, yeah, as and which you please, and we'll just jump in with yourself.
My name's Cameron. I mostly campaign with Insulate Britain, and I now campaign with Just Stop Oil. I've worked on buildings, and I've seen that they're not being done right, and so I saw a campaign that was going to really, really bring that to mass public attention, and that's why I got involved with Insulate Britain.
Yeah, hi, my name's Seneca Weiraman. I've been working with a lot of campaigns to stop demolition of council estates, particularly in Lambeth. It's good to see a few campaigners in the audience. I've also been a part of UVW SAW, trying to encourage especially young architectural assistants to realize what their rights are, to stop working overtime and not getting paid for it. And on the architectural front, I've been trying to get residents to develop their own people's plans in response to the regeneration / gentrification of their communities. And together with groups like Architects of Social Housing and campaign groups like Save Central Hill and Save Crescent Gardens.
Thanks. My name is Sam Griffiths. I'm a recovering branding designer, and I now I set up my own business to run community projects and kind of creative workshops. I've got a big interest in using public space and inviting people to be imaginative and bringing people together. But then last summer, 40 degrees hit, and I just had like a profound insight into the future of my son. He's 13 at the moment. And from that point on, I started taking action with Just Stop Oil. And it's been a really interesting ride, and it's been like, I've learned a lot. I maybe get a chance to speak about that a bit later, but yeah, that's what spurred me into action. And do I have 1 minute? So I just want to build on what Quato was saying earlier. I think I really resonated what he said around 40 degrees, climate change, migration coming, the lack of mitigation from government. And I just wanted to build on his ask where he was asking us to ask our politicians to care. And I don't think it's time for that now. We have to demand it. And I think that's what we're doing with direct action. And I'll hand it over now. Thank you.
Yeah, that's very much where I'm coming from too. I'm Grace, I'm part of Housing Rebellion. I've been involved in sort of grassroots direct action housing campaigns for about 25 years. But like most people, I started to worry about the end of the world a few years ago and got involved with Extinction Rebellion. And so Housing Rebellion is a kind of what seems an obvious marriage of these two movements, bringing climate campaigners and housing campaigners together, and really drawing the connections that we're all essentially fighting the same system. Behind the housing crisis, the climate crisis, it's the same problem we're battling, which is just a complete lack of democratic control. Everything's for profit, and just what we build, how we build, where we build it, how we live, the land, how do we get back that control? So the whole ethos of Extinction Rebellion and direct action, taking action where the problem is, completely fits with fighting on the housing crisis as well. So that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you very much. So we're going to try and stick with lived experience kind of quite heavily as well. So just as a kind of next kind of provocation and invitation, what is kind of one story that sticks with you from your campaigning? So from the work you've done, the things you've been involved in, what stands out to you the most? What moment kind of embodies the sort of action you think we need to be taking, but also what did you kind of feel that personally? So we'll just go back along the opposite way as well.
Yeah, I'll give an example from the very first campaign I got involved in housing. This was 25 years ago. I was a socialist standing in an election, and somebody came to me and said they were being evicted, and could I help? And my socialist thing kicked into gear, and I said, okay, well, let's fight, let's stop this eviction. And we put leaflets around the estate next to where the man was being evicted, asking people to come and stand with him. And it was a sort of a theoretical belief that people would come and support it, but it actually happened. People came, and they came and stood with him, and we resisted, and then the eviction never happened, and we ended up just staying, and we stayed round the clock for weeks, and we built a massive campaign, and we ended up marching and demanding that the council buy the block where he lived, which was a developer was evicting them to redevelop the site, and we won. And that doesn't happen very often, but it won, and it was people power, and it was community organising and resistance and fighting back against just this developer juggernaut that didn't care about the people who lived there, and that really set me up forever, really, about believing that people, if we get organised and we fight back, we can change things, and yeah, that's where I'm coming from.
Thanks. I think I started taking action with Just Stop Oil back in October last year, and we had a march on October the 2nd, and we went down to Waterloo Bridge, and we very quietly sat down, and some people were lying down, and it was very eloquent and very quiet, and this was the first time I'd ever done anything like this, and I just had maybe 20 minutes as people just stood their ground or sat down and just took that space to think about, at the same time, people were being warned that they would be arrested and moved off the bridge. But I had 20 minutes to think, what am I going to do here? And what my place was here, and what could I step into, and what was I comfortable doing? And I was profoundly moved by the people there was a couple who work in the NHS, and they were just hugging quietly, and it was just so moving seeing people who collectively were really choosing to see what's happening that we are on the brink of collapse and accepting it and taking action in light of it. And I just felt I could be part of that. And so I stayed and I was arrested. And for me, it was, I know everyone can make this step, and it's a lot easier for some people who are white, middle class, fairly non-threatening. So it's like, I have a very different arrest experience to other people, perhaps. But for me, it was hugely empowering because it showed me that I could stand in the way of harm, or in that instance, actually sit in the way of harm. And I could stand up to the state, which is criminally just negligent. It's the things that are happening right now with Rosebank being licensed, the walk back on climate policy. It's just beggars belief. But I think we have to accept that the Labour Party aren't going to save us when they come into power. It's us. We have to do it. And it was that was a moment where I realised we collectively have that power.
Okay, there are a few things. The first one, I was in Sri Lanka when the tsunami struck. But fortunately, my immediate family weren't affected. But I was working in architectural practice, which then started to develop plans to help with the next stages. And so when I saw that, I thought, oh, okay, then we can start planning our futures. But then when the politics and money came in and corruption, then you kind of saw all these ideas just completely, all those good ideas just completely get, pardon the pun, but washed away, which is a bad, very bad legacy for everyone who was affected by the tsunami. But it did politicize. It did politicize me. It did show how the mental health of people everywhere gets affected. How people are. And so this is when I'm going to end on a more positive note. But it is quite depressing when your homes are affected by. Not just by natural causes, but outside forces. And every single person I've met in the housing campaigns that I've been involved with, it just wears everyone down, right? So one positive thing I can say from that is the networks and, for example, the WhatsApp groups that I look at my phone every morning and there's 60, 70, 80 messages. And that, in a way, helps others who are going through a hell of a lot of stuff which you never think that you'd be in. But that's one way of, as you were saying, we have to do these things for ourselves. Because it's just... It's just wearing a lot of people down. So yeah, the networks, that's a positive thing.
On the 3rd of May this year, a new amendment to the Public Order Bill came out, which was anything more than minor disruption constitutes that they can issue a Section 12 and arrest you and the rest of it. So I decided to take a little walk between 10 Downing Street and Parliament at a snail's pace, because this is bullshit. And I think that's the best place to be on that day. And so when the police issued the Section 12, I just kept very, very slowly walking until I was arrested. And there was a lady on the pavement who had been watching all of this. And she was really emotional seeing it. She was really, really crying. And she just she was uttering thank you. And then she pulled out a Star of David necklace around her neck, and there was just this real understanding of that we are being oppressed by the state, and she has a real heartfelt attachment to what that has been like for her ancestors, perhaps her parents. It was just really powerful. And then last week I was in court for that trial, and I won, because the judge perhaps like my suit, I had burnt all my suit and written some of the countries that had experienced wildfires this year, summer. But she felt the police were overreaching and it was not proportional. So that's encouraging for anyone who'd like to walk really slowly on the road with Just Stop Oil.
Thank you very much. So we're going to spin your usual question and answer format. So we're going to go along again, but this is going to be more along the lines of allyship. So how can you support people directly resisting? But also, what would it look like if we built the kind of generative infrastructure? So the first kind of wonder is, how can people show up for you, if not alongside you, supporting Power With? But also, what would your day look like if your demand was met? So if your demand was met, what would you, not what else you'd be doing with your time, but how would that affect your life? And then after that, we're going to have invitations from the audience. So we've had mentioned there's some campaigns for saving buildings. If you're from a campaign who wants people directed to you, we're going to ask for some hands up. So we're just going to go along again. So what does allyship look like? How can people support your campaign? If they can't stand beside you, what can they be doing just in their life? And again, we are recognizing that everyone's experience of the world is different, and especially people's treatment by the police, and especially the Metropolitan Police. So we know this, so we can't just say, get on the road. We're just going to put that line there, just for politeness sake. But what does allyship mean to you? What does it mean? We've heard a few stories. What does it mean when people show up? And how can they amplify your demand and support similar campaigns? So we'll go on again. And once we hit the end, if you want to invite people to help you, if you want support, raise your hand when we hit the end, and we'll start throwing this microphone. Metaphorically, I'll pass it into the audience to take kind of invitations from you as well.
So Insulate Britain's demand was taken on by Just Stop Oil, which is now the main civil resistance movement in the UK, which is part of this A22 network all around the world, sharing resources and experience. And Sam will talk more on what Just Stop Oil is doing. And so Insulate Britain, you know, it was a short campaign. It really brought something to the public's attention, and now all parties have something to say on insulation. And the Great British Insulation Scheme was nearly called Insulate Britain. There was a leak from the room where they were like, oh, we'll call it the Insulate Britain. And no. What I would say is get into building, like become a carpenter or like something practical. It's like hugely fulfilling to see your work in a really like physical way at the end of the day. Today I've been hauling like triple glazed windows around up and down buildings. Like some days it's really not so great, but like it is a really, really rich job, and I would particularly invite women to come and join it. Like it's a really toxic masculine environment, and I think if there was like a female in that room, they just wouldn't talk that way. Like this new crew I just joined, like I was actually sick at the end of the week. Like it's disgusting. And like, I've got a recycling bin now. I'm like getting there with them. But like, it would just really help to have more people that care about natural build materials, about these things, just come and get involved in like a hands-on way. So find a way to like skill up in a practical way.
We should grow concrete as well, right? Yeah. Well, yeah, so I would urge, there are quite a few architects in the room, engineers, get involved in a local housing campaign. There are a lot of residents who need your skills and advice. It's a way of like, it actually being part of the Essential Hill campaign actually made me understand what community actually, like the real meaning of it. We kind of like use it quite flippantly sometimes. So that's something which I would encourage quite a few architects, because there are quite a few council estates under threat of demolition. I would also like urge, because there are issues as well, so we need to try and find a way of funding and making sure that these projects are taken seriously by councils as well. So we just need to like keep on pushing and support and pushing campaigns like, supporting campaigns like Save Crescent Gardens and Central Hill as well. And there will be a few others which are going to come up in the next years.
I want to say first, the work you're doing, there's profound ideas and insights, and all of that is hugely valuable, and bringing them together and networking is very powerful. You have your work. I think there is other work I'd invite you to do as well, which is to stand in civil resistance and stand in the way of harm. We are seeing profound harms around the world. We face the worst risks we have ever faced as a species. And we have to, it's not being acknowledged in the media where we are. You know, we are risking collapse. That means the end of society. So I would invite you to just really sit with that emotionally and intellectually. Like, what does that mean? For me, what motivates me is, food supply. We've seen what has happened to Spain and Greece. Greece lost a huge section of its breadbasket in the recent floods. This is at 1.2-ish degrees. We're going to go through 1.5 soon. We're heading to 2 within 2030. What is the point where all these pressures are too much for our social systems to maintain themselves? We really have to wrestle with this reality. And I think this is the risk. This is what keeps me up at night, but this is what inspires action. So I go out on the road because I fear for my son's future. I fear that our children, before they reach our age, are going to be starving, if I'm really honest with you. And this is the risk we're facing. And we just have to be honest and say those things. It feels like in this society at the moment they're unsayable. We have to say them, we have to face them. And I think the way of facing it is by coming together collectively. We don't take action because we all feel that we're individuals, and as individuals we can't affect anything, but we can. We don't be one person, is what I'm saying. So be part of us, or whatever movement that is taking real meaningful action. I would love to invite you to march with us. We're going to be marching from October 29th for the next few weeks after that. You'd be very welcome to join us. That will be arrestable. And I know that's a big step for people, but it will be arrestable. But there's all sorts of ways to support our work that is non-arrestable. There are many volunteer roles, there are lots of support roles, working in police station support, enabling, putting up people in accommodation. There's a lot you can do to be an ally for this movement that doesn't risk arrest. But I do think, just going back to Waterloo Bridge, there's a profound meaning to stepping into arrest and standing up to what this state is doing. And that's...
Well, yeah, I just want to 100% endorse what you're saying. I do think we need to understand that the system we're in is entirely rigged against us. We will not win or change anything by playing by the rules of the system as it is in place at the moment. We have to be prepared to step outside of what's allowed, what's legal, what's meant, how we're supposed to, wait for the next election to sort everything out. It's not going to work, and we do have to be prepared to step up into direct action. And what we're trying to do with Housing Rebellion is find those forms of direct action which people can engage in where they live, defending their homes, being, resisting, losing this respect for private property, right? Just because the housing association owns all these properties, why should they be allowed to leave them empty? What gives them the right to leave houses empty when people need homes and we need to retrofit them? We are not just dealing with lack of political will or uncare. We're dealing with people who are actively trying to stop us from retrofitting homes, leaving them empty, building new developments that we can't afford environmentally or financially. There are really serious vested interest players that we need to challenge, and we need to be prepared to take direct action to do that. So, like in the Lesnes estate, which is one of the estates being demolished in Thamesmead, we've been campaigning with the residents, and we took over an empty house, and that's illegal, but we didn't get arrested, because what are they going to do? How are they going to justify that they're leaving those houses empty? We took it over and occupied it for 3 days to use as a space for residents on the estate to organise, to talk to more people about why we need to challenge Peabody, challenge the housing association, fight for the right to retrofit this estate, because that's what the residents there are facing. Their homes are going to be demolished if they don't fight back. So we're putting ourselves in with communities who have got these, who are fighting back, and we're saying we're willing to put ourselves on the line. We're willing to take direct action. We're willing to occupy buildings. We're willing to resist evictions. We're willing to support people who refuse to leave when they make them leave so they can demolish their homes. And if they refuse to leave, we need to be standing there with them to fight any attempt to evict them. So there's lots of forms of direct action, but it does mean stepping up and saying, I don't respect your right because you own this land to do what you like with it. And say, we can organise, we can fight back, and collectively maybe have a chance. All right, thank you.
Great. So, do we have anyone in the audience currently taking part in a campaign or is organising to? So, we're going to pass to yourself first. Would you like to kick us off? And just thank you very much to all of our panelists for being so honest and sharing your life experiences, because it is kind of shied away from in kind of society to say, this is what I believe in, this is what I'm doing. So much gratitude for your contributions. So could we have another round of applause before we go? Okay, great. So just invite as well.
My name is Georgina. I'm a council tenant involved with campaigning with, I was on that march you were talking about, so yeah, I probably know all of you indirectly. I have a petition that I set up just over a week ago, and it's about, I'll just read it out. It's use empty housing blocks to train up a retrofit task force directly employed by the council, or they could be cooperatives. Okay, so I cite Lambeth as an example, but what's happening in Lambeth is happening all over the country. And that is that council estates, housing association estates are being demolished and replaced mainly by private housing. And on the estate that I have a picture of on here, you look at the figures, they're actually planning on demolishing the estate, building back -8 council rent homes, but over 200 private. Okay, so there's a housing crisis. There's about 3,800 in Lambeth are in temporary accommodation, and they're not even bothering to build back more social homes. Okay, so what's happening on this estate, and again, as I say, it's happening on other estates. They've built a decamp block, they've moved people out of these blocks into the decamp block, or they've left the estate. So there's near empty blocks here, which if they were retrofitted instead, they could be used to train up a retrofit task force. We're short of people to do that work, who know how to do the work. So they could be used to train up a workforce, at the same time retrofitting the council homes, bringing them back as council homes. And by doing that alone on this one estate, they would end up with more council homes than in the entire 6-estate demolition programme that they have in Lambeth. Okay, so it just makes sense. It's common sense. So. Sorry?
How do we find the petition?
Well, this is on change.org. So, I mean, I don't know.
We can share it as well.
Should I hand it around? I need this paper back because I've got Kwaja's contact details on here.
Yeah, we'll
so I need it back. It's called Use Empty Housing Blocks to train up a retrofit task force, it's a bit of a mouthful, directly employed by the council. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are we okay to wrap up now? Is that okay?
So we're going to wrap this session up, but if you would like to talk to our panel more, I'm sure you'll have welcome ears. But again, thank you very much for the time, and thank you for the space to speak as well. So
thank you so much. Folks, I really, I don't know everyone, but I know Sam well enough, and I know Scott really well. This is on behalf of myself and lots of us who aren't able to do the same things that you are, or it's not the thing that we're safest to do. Not that I'm saying you're not risking your safety. I just want to say a huge thank you, because I know, Sam, your journey more particularly, and so I'm sure everybody's has its own version. And also just from last year's Retrofit Reimagined, where you were organising and designing with us on the street, to me turning around and suddenly seeing, okay, Sam's gone in a different and very inspiring direction. I want to say a huge thank you, but also it might not appear it, but the amount of labour and energy and preparation and work it takes for Scott to prepare and do that kind of presentation for us is a real gift. And I know it takes it out of you. I know what it takes out of all of us. So what I just want to say is, can we just have a really, applause is the thing we do here, right? So can we have a really warm round of applause to show our gratitude to those who are doing this work. Thank you so much. And believe it or not, we are coming closer to the end of the day, and we have a wonderful closing conversation with some peers that I admire really, really deeply. So I'm going to invite this panel to join. If you'd like to chat to them, you can go over to the platform or in the Crescent as well. Everyone who's staying for this last lovely panel, come forward. Let's give them some love. Hello to everyone joining on the live stream, because I know there's been some questions about when this one starts. We're starting now. Very lovely to welcome you. Come forward. Come on up, Josh. Come on up, lovely panel. And I'm going to actually just hand over to Josh, but we're running a program with Centric Lab called Ecological Health in Neighbourhoods. And again, the generosity of knowledge and vision that exists in Centric and in the partners that are about to come up now is really, really profound. And I think you're in for a treat, and I'm going to leave you in their capable hands, because you don't need to hear any more from me. We're not going to do a large wrap-up. So when this panel finishes, I'm going to say thank you, because we're going to go over time a little bit. And then our team will be around in the Crescent for anyone who wants to talk about what's next, coming to another venue, contributing to the programming, anything you want to do. We still have 3 stops on this tour left. You feel cross about something, you feel like something's not there, you want to organise around something, come and tell us, come and tell Sarah, Charlie, Civic Square team. We can help make that happen, because we've still got 3 stops left. So on this note, we won't do a huge wrap-up. We'll just say lovely, thank you, and we will be around to talk about any follow-ups as well. On that note, I'm going to leave you actually with just the most remarkable set of people. I really hope you enjoy it. Come forward, come and sit down, don't be passive, and thank you very much on behalf of all of us. Follow us on socials, you'll see everything that's happening next.
Awesome, thank you, Amy. Yeah, well done for hanging on. I'm going to shake about a little bit, because I'm a little bit like an Energizer bunny when I like to give a bit of a talk, so feel free to shake out your limbs and get your heart going, because we've got an hour, but we've got an hour of fun. And I'm going to try and not be a game show host, but it's going to fall a little bit like that as we go through, because we're at the end of the day. So I'm going to set a little bit of an intro as to who we are and kind of what we do, and set the precedent for why we've got such brilliant speakers that you're going to love. So on the board is a little phrase. That's what we do at Centric Lab. We are building radical infrastructure for communal healing. What does that really mean? It means that we're prototyping ways to use health and scientific evidence to support justice movements. As we try and understand our pathways out of the struggles that we're in, how do we, and I'm going to borrow a line that I heard from Farzana earlier, how do we build this post-capitalist infrastructure we need for healing in community and in place? And so some of the things that we're doing is understanding the different sort of and non-Western epistemologies about health, about being, and how these translate into new structures that we need to live by. So I'm going to play on the word Reimagined a little bit. And this is actually a picture of dynamic glass, and something that Centric were doing in, I think, 2017. We were trying to put together a scientific experiment when we're a different type of organization to help a dynamic glass company understand whether certain conditions of light would support cognitive function. Pretty straightforward question that lots of scientists try and understand. The only problem was that it was really hard to actually isolate the two variables, because you didn't know how someone's going to walk into a building and the conditions from the night before, the week before, the year before, the chronic experiences that they may have been experiencing may have an effect on how they sit down to do a task. So the condition of light was kind of irrelevant based on the simple factors: what was the condition of their sleep the night before? So we heard earlier about social housing, the conditions that people live in. What if that heating was on full time during the summer? Were people actually able to sleep? And you compare that to someone's sort of homeostasis arriving, who might have been living in a nice rural environment surrounded by sheep, where I actually now live, not there, but yes, surrounded by sheep in Wales. And so when you arrive at a desk, based on that journey, that condition, that urban lived experience, you're going to be in a very different physiological state, which is going to change how you kind of have a cognitive function. How do we know this? Well, in neuroscience, which isn't just the story of what goes on behind psychology, you have a central nervous system, and that's what the study of neuroscience is, the brain and the central nervous system. So our team, and I'm not a scientist, don't worry, I'm not going to scare you with complex terms, but it's a way to understand. We have this thing called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. We kind of colloquially can know this as the kind of fight or flight system, but really it's about the stress response. So this has been our way of communicating with the world around us since effectively we have become human beings. If you think about some terrible analogies, if you have a bus flying towards you, or in other cases like an animal, your body will go, uh-oh, and have to respond and produce things like adrenaline. But this also happens in the way that our skin will be sensing heat, the skin will be sensing cold, the way that our bodies will also be ingesting particulate matter and going, hang on, this isn't quite right. This is causing an inflammation because it's not necessary for me. I've got to produce something to respond. And so what happens is you go through this entire process, and unfortunately, when that process is chronic, it leads to a dysregulation of a system because it's only meant to be temporary, not continually exposed. And what we find is that in urban environments, there is a chronic exposure to things like air, noise, light, and heat, these environmental factors that cause this stress response system to chronically engage and lead to a dysregulation. The only issue is that this system is helping mediate things like your immune system, your endocrine and your hormone system, as well as your metabolic system. These fundamental things that we need to live and live by. And so it becomes, there we go. So how do we kind of understand those kind of factors from an urban point of view? Well, some of the things that we tried to do was go, well, if we know that air pollution exists and noise pollution exists and light pollution exists and heat pollution exists, and we know that the experiences of deprivation as an indicator towards those kind of psychosocial stresses, those factors that we cannot escape. The idea of being in insecure housing that we know we cannot escape. The fact that we live in an environment where the schools are not good enough for children, we know we cannot escape that factor. And we know that there may be other structural marginalizations and deprivations that we occur that we cannot escape. Those are burdens upon our system. And that acts as a form of wear and tear. So one of the things that we did, for example, as a tool was create one by mapping all of those different data sets together and getting a nice sort of heat map. And some people would say, like in a local authority, oh yeah, we've seen that kind of stuff with the index of multiple deprivation. You go, but yes, but you're framing it from an economics point of view, not from a human and a health point of view. And once you reimagine how you're actually framing an urban environment, you start to rethink the solutions. So I wouldn't say just take my word on it. I'll get to the other smarter people, but it's a way of understanding. If we start to look at the urban environment from the experience point of view, we can better understand that our health is not static. It is not constrained to the fact that we may eat a certain food or go exercise. It is a constant dynamic interaction with the world around us. And that is, so the built, living, and social. Don't take my word for it, and I take that man with the great beard. It's always a good sign, but these are two fantastic researchers. So on the left, Professor Arlene T. Geronimus coined in 1992. At the time, it was called the weathering hypothesis, now known as the weathering effect. Her question was, why were there disproportionately worse health outcomes in racialized African-American women, often single, often working? The question was not, is it their ethnicity as a condition of their health, but actually the structural marginalizations and the intersectional marginalizations were a cause of wear and tear on the system, suppressing that immune system, dysregulating the endocrine as well as things like metabolic systems. So it's no wonder we see different types of health conditions in those who have been racialized. It is not a condition of their ethnicity, but the environments in which they have been forced to live for not only 5, 10, but maybe 500 years. And Professor Robert Sapolsky, who I recommend that if that link still works, a really good an interview that talks about the experience of poverty. Sapolsky is a neuroendocrinologist, far smarter than me, but I recommend listening to him talking about the experience of poverty and its wear and tear on our systems. So this is Professor Nick Tyler, who's actually a professor of, as he calls it, civilized engineering. And when we start to think about our lived experience in the urban environment, and one of the things that we try to use about it, for example, from our point of view about sort of neuroscience in this way, he said a great line, which helps us kind of re-understand, because when people think about, oh, let's design buildings that make us healthy, let's design urban environments that make us happy, it's actually a very incorrect term and sort of framing to look at it, because you're trying to take a very episodic experience, this kind of short-term elation of an idea, and extrapolate it to a spatial condition. And he said a great line that he's always thought that neuroscience is less about space and more about time. And I think that's one of the things that we're going to kind of get on and talk about a little bit more. And that in our point of view, the ability to use something like the central nervous system and the HPA axis as a way to understand people's time in these built environments, their long-term experiences, and what are the infrastructures, and in this case, the post-capitalist infrastructures that are going to be needed if we're going to reimagine actually retrofitting the urban and built environment and that social infrastructure. If we just continue in the same way, we're just going to create effectively electric vehicles, but for the built environment. Anyone knows that if you want to reduce air pollution, you don't change electric vehicles, you change the actual dynamic as why someone gets in a car in the first place. So the more we kind of see design as the only solution, we're always going to think of design solutions. So there's, I won't think of that analogy, but it moves away from the kind of the lived realities that we have. And this is, I'm just going to quickly go through this. For example, I think it's the NHS talk about good housing is a condition for good health. So when someone does a health impact assessment on a new regeneration scheme, it goes, new housing, good for people's health, great. But what is the quality of that housing? Does it actually affect the lived experience of many of us? What does it mean to multi-generational living? What does it mean to people who work from home? All of those conditions. So this is from Numa Studio, and they looked at a project of what does it look like for people, for example, in Enfield, and interviewing people who live in the borough and better understand what is the type of housing typology that would better suit how people live. So it's not a question of space, it's a question of how people live in this time, and how does design respond. The same way that when we think about green space, everyone thinks, yeah, yes, green space. So this actually comes from the health impact assessment. And as it talks about, and I don't expect you to read it, but if you want, you can read it. But it talks about, yes, we need proximity to green space because we can build green space, and green space is good for people's health. But under what conditions, how, and why? Is it actually good for their health, or are we thinking about it purely in a spatial term, not a human term? And the reason I bring that up is that we actually did a study, it's actually for a developer called Lendlease, trying to look at the relationship between green space and childhood obesity. And actually, when you look at the statistics, there was no correlation between proximity to a green space and health outcomes. There were worse, for example, childhood obesity health outcomes in Barking and Dagenham, which has some of the highest levels of green space. So the question isn't necessarily, do we build and therefore they will do well? The question is, well, actually, what is the point of green space? What is the point of nature when it actually relates to our own health and our own systems? And so you speak to a microbial ecologist, someone like Dr. Jake Robinson, and they'll just start to talk about the microbiome that comes from green spaces. So many of us will know when we step into deep nature and you crush the leaves and the sticks and the mud beneath you, you will smell something. And that's kind of your body going, yum, I needed those enzymes. I needed that bacteria. Not only my skin microbiome, but my gut microbiome needed that nutrients, because that's actually how we're meant to live. So when we think about green space, are we actually just delivering grass, or actually delivering something that actually is meaningful to us in not only a child's development or perhaps a pregnant person's development and in the in-womb experience of that child and how that relationship is? So the idea of we build a park, we think in spatial typologies, we're going to miss the point exactly of our lived experience and what it means. So unfortunately, Sophie has had to disappear, but I wanted to kind of set a scene as when we talk about health, for example, in the built environment, it's a great biological metric to question all those different determinants that come together and influence everything around us. talked about how we have to think about our lived experience, how we have to build a new infrastructure that is representative to that, and not just think about the built environment in a form of spatial typologies. And so I have some wonderful speakers here. So I'm going to get a little bit game show now. I'm going to try and get a little bit Cilla Black, which is one for the kids out there, and ask everyone to kind of give themselves a 30 to 60-second intro, just who you are, what you do, and then we're going to go into some questions and we're going to explore a little bit more about this topic. So, Hannah, over to you to go first.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, I'm Hannah Yu Pearson, and I'm a researcher and practitioner of Chinese healing practices, and I have a background in sustainable urbanism, in city-level climate action, and I'm currently working at the intersection of urbanism, health, as well as Chinese philosophical frameworks like Taoism. And I've been contributing to Centric's research on traditional ecological knowledge systems, as well as bits of other work that they're doing. So I'm excited to share a bit of these overlaps with you all and how it relates to retrofit and the built environment.
I'm Fazana. I'm one of the co-founders and co-directors at Healing Justice London. We work to build capacity for transformation on a structural level, on an interpersonal level, and on a movement and sustained level. My background's in community organizing and youth work, and I also think it's important to visualize, because this work requires so much creativity. There's an artist and creative in me, and not always organizing around despair and fight, but also organizing around vision and hope.
My name is Akil. This is also my colleague and brother, Seth. And we're directors of Resolve Collective, which is an interdisciplinary design collective. We work between art, architecture, engineering, and technology to address social issues. A lot of the work revolves around a design philosophy called using the site as a resource. And for us, that means the appraisal and also the valuing and celebration of local materials, but also local knowledges. We're based in Croydon, which has unfortunately been on the news recently. I'm sure some of you have seen that. And that's where our HQ is, but we have a translocal approach, so we are often in many, many places and trying to feed back the knowledges and the experiences from all those places as well. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. Actually, this first question is for you, Fazana. You're going to go up first. So can you speak into the ways in which Healing Justice London has been building transformative research culture, something you mentioned just before, and the methodologies you use, and perhaps speaking to some of the projects, such as Death by Welfare and Litany for Survival. And yeah, we're going to open it up for 5 to 10 minutes at the most. And it's the same for everyone. Allow yourself to expand, be free.
Thank you. And also thank you for, I didn't know I was going to be able to make this today. And very last minute, I had said to Imi, I can actually make it. And then I ended up on 2 panels. So I'm sorry if you're hearing me twice today, opening and closing. And I think I'll pick up on some of the things I touched on in the morning. I spoke much more to vision in the morning. And today, I think right now, I'll speak to strategy and methodology and try and do some connective work. I also want to reference that the phrase post-capitalist infrastructure I learned from Al-Noor Lada's work, so citation is feminist memory. So I just want to say that's where I'd kind of heard that phrase. In terms of our work at Healing Justice London, I maybe want to begin around the ways in which we've been, where we're located. So a lot of our work has come from decades of community work, organizing, particularly for communities that experience marginalization, who are dispossessed from space, including their own bodies, and our bodies are sites of harm, and we don't get to inhabit any space. There's no space in which, so if we're talking about spatial justice, what does that mean when you don't get to be, just be? And that's an ontological question, but it's also one of justice and how we do the work of healing and health. And Healing Justice has really been in that kind of process of learning what does it mean for us to be here, and what are the conditions and contexts that support our being here in ways that are safe, dignifying, and ensure like mutual thriving. we never intended to have like a research culture, or but what we knew was that the ways in which we were understanding and being understood were deeply colonial, capitalistic, disembodied, and reproduced harm on our communities. And so we were trying to community evidence gather in lots of different ways. Like, what does it mean for us to document what we know, what we're finding and discovering? And a lot, we use this phrase lived experience, but essentially that's what it was, is that we don't see ourselves represented in the standard knowledge production that is seen as valid. So how do we do it on our own terms and make that valid and robust and accessible? Along the road, we started a piece of research called A Litany for Survival in homage to Audre Lorde, and it really looked at the relationship between loss and bereavement and race, and really kind of connected the level of structural loss that marginalized communities, particularly racialized communities, had ongoingly, and that is a form of chronic stress as a way of slow violence, that you're constantly undergoing multiple forms of loss. And there's a really interesting study by Nina Vaswani where she looks at, if you experience multiple forms of loss, you enter a place called non-recovery, which leads to things like a risk-taking behavior of substance reliance, being homeless, all these types of things. And what we see as a correlation to that is a relationship between multiple forms of loss and the carceral prison system. So currently up to 90% of the adult male population have experienced up to six bereavements. So structurally, these things matter, like oppression, the ways in which our experiences live out, then live out in the structures. And it's a feedback loop, as Indy said earlier. Through that research, a piece of work that we have right now is called Deaths by Welfare, and it's led by my incredible colleague, Dr. China Mills, who is leads in incredible global decolonial mental health and suicidality. And this piece of research, built with disabled activists, what it has done is it has charted 50 years of welfare reform, and its links to the suicides of disabled and chronically sick people. And I'm not anti-welfare. I grew up on a council estate with benefits, and our lives depend on welfare. But currently, that design harms so many of us, especially those that are racialized or working class. And so, what we found with this timeline is essentially it was community evidencing. People put into this research, which documents the 50 years, has testimonies from coroners and autopsy reports saying this person was not fit for work, suicide notes, bereaved family members' testimonies. And so what we've done is that we've built this timeline, and then the timeline is going to be exhibited at Block 336 from October the 11th to November the 11th. There's an online accessible timeline as well, and artists have also worked with us, particularly disabled artists or lived experience, to interpret the timeline. So we can start to evidence what is happening, but specifically speaking to this issue of designed violence. Like when we're talking about spatial justice, we also need to talk about not just hostile design, but the designing of the ways in which our lives, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about it, organized abandonment, that it's structural. And because it's designed, we can design out of it too. It takes a lot of creativity and imagining and retrofitting, reimagining, but it's possible. And one of the frameworks that I want to also point to is disability justice, because disability justice as a framework led by disabled folks really speaks to this thing that we live in societies designed to deem certain bodies valuable, disposable, or desired. And what would it mean for us to design our environments, our societies, our contexts, our communities with the design principles that held our dignity, that held the genius of sick bodies and disabled bodies, because all of us will face disability and sickness at some point. And that's not the reason we would do it, but actually to hold other types of frameworks that understand what it means to affirm life and be life-affirming. And this is not new as well. These are in our indigenous technologies. In the Muslim tradition, we have a waqf system, which is a cradle-to-grave welfare system. So it exists already for many of us in our traditions, where you're looking at social provision that holds the totality of someone's experiences, but also the vulnerabilities that they might encounter in life. I want to just very quickly, do I have time? What are we doing for time? Very quickly touch on a few, I want to give an example, but a few methodology points that are central to our practice. You've heard me talk about it earlier this morning, somatics, and somatics not just being a connection to the body, but soma being that we are living, changing organisms in connection with the body, each other, the land, and that we're evolving, and it's this organism that is embedded in multiple forms of connectivity. And so we use somatics as a way to repair the violence of disconnection, to have a different relational politics, to understand what it means to have an interface, a bodily interface, an emotional interface, a spiritual interface, an intellectual interface with our environment, and then know how to respond to it or be met by it. And so these things are really important, and as we start to repair our reality through this lens, we're able to design better futures, better environments, lived experience that we really understand those that live at the sharpest edges are the people most equipped and are already surviving and possessing a genius because they've survived it. And what would it mean to resource that genius to have sustainable solutions and strategies that contribute to a robust mainstream and everyone can benefit from it. Trauma work. We know that from when we're traumatized, and lots of people have talked about it, we actually can't imagine. We can't move from a long-term imagining space. The allostatic load, the cumulative trauma that Josh spoke to, means that we are in self-preservation mode, that we can only think of the self, not the we, but we also can't think long-term. So if we want radical futures that are sustainable, we need to be doing the trauma work in order to be able to politicize trauma work, in order for us to be able to vision in ways that don't reproduce and re-erect the structures of violence that we experience. I just want to give a very clear example because it's already happening. And I think Civic Square, you do that work. So I want to say when I came to B16, my heart expanded because of the ways in which you are doing the deep structural work as well as the community repair that's needed in tandem. But I was recently, and this is to shout out to Gabriela Gomez Montt, who was the Chief Creative Officer of Mexico City, where she was building care blocks. I had the honor of being with her in Colombia and Bogota, where they have been building care blocks. And what care blocks are essentially blocks where you have different types of social provisions, all within 30 minutes walk from laundry rooms that save women 7 hours a week in terms of doing laundry, spaces for education for children that are below the age of 3 that can be taken care of, provisions for the elderly, spaces for gender justice and men to learn about emotional literacy because gender-based violence is a huge thing. But the heart of the care blocks was that these were spaces that were for women who held an economy that held invisible labor, 9 in 10 women being carers. And the main thing that you would ask them is like, what do you need? And they said time. They needed time, as you spoke to Josh, in order to be able to live the lives that they wanted to live. And this care economy that they were holding was the thing that was also revealing what does it mean to build care-filled societies. We needed spaces of education, spaces of rest, spaces where children could be taken care of. And it's already live. There's 20 care blocks across Bogota where they can't actually build the local infrastructure. They've built buses to go into the rural area. So I really encourage you to look at Gabriela Gomez's work and Bogota as an example of having this care infrastructure that can be built, and it's happening, and I really want to leave it at that point. And it's the work that we are working towards at Healing Justice London as well, prototyping localized infrastructure like that.
Round of applause, yeah. Thank you very much, Rosanna. I think you can see in my excitement to try and get to the talk, I kind of missed a little bit of a preface that one of the things we're trying to uncover in this is that from the kind of wider architecture, engineering, construction sectors, who are we speaking with and what is the literature that we're following? Are we just following things that come out of the RIBA and the BREEAMs, etc.? But why is an architect, for example, not actually reviewing what a health impact assessment is, for example, that type of documentation? Who is delivering that type of assessment? Who are the stakeholders involved in that? We have to kind of reimagine that type of kind of networked infrastructure. And I think building on part of what Farzana has just talked about, I think there's a straight line to the work you've been doing, part of the Urban Health Council program on traditional ecological knowledges, and I think that it's something that you'll go into detail about, but you know, it's gaining a lot of momentum in the design world. The idea of like, oh, let's bring in kind of like indigenous thoughts, etc., and deliver it, you know, a bunch of green in front of an office building. But there's a lot more to that. In the same way that if we just think about, if you go look at census data, for example, in the UK, we don't recognise the term indigenous. The idea that BIPOC doesn't exist in the English and UK literature, it does in the United States. And so we have a group of people who identify with indigeneity being erased. So it's very messy if we just were to focus on looking at census data, look at a place and go, oh, okay, well, there's this type of people, this type of people, this type of people. We know how to do that, but that's not actually representative. So I guess, Hannah, can you start to expand on some of the framings that it means to not only recognize people who identify indigenous to look and live with indigeneity as a way of being, but the principles around engagement and kind of what it means for the kind of the future of urban systems?
It's a big question. So with Centric and Urban Health Council, we've been working on principles for how to engage with traditional ecological knowledges, which is knowledge from indigenous peoples, from landkin peoples, and people that work with like an ecology that's like really deep-seated in their own practices. And it's important to see this traditional ecological knowledge as a plural term. It's plural. There's many different forms of knowledge. And the way this comes into a design process or a design discourse is you can't hack your way in the current system with like a cool thing that can be done somewhere else. So it's like bearing in mind that traditional ecological knowledge is coming into design. It's being called low tech, like TEK, and it's being called low tech, or all these things. So there's different framings that indigenous knowledge and ecological knowledge is being put that's really to the side and trying to maybe give it a seat at the table. But the whole idea of this is not to give tech a seat at the table, but kind of to just think, get rid of the table itself, or just like come off it, you know, like you can't bring in what is like knowledge that is so deep inside of people into like a design hack or like a way to like do a master plan. So yeah, it's thinking about knowledge as it's known in the body, as it's known relationally, and how can you, as you're approaching traditional ecological knowledge, how can you be ready to receive what that is? So it's not just being like, oh, let me just like learn a few things, but it's like this knowledge is so deep, it's really spiritual, it's passed down ancestrally, it's from the land. So how can I, with humility, come to this knowledge ready to receive it with humility? And in the process of this requires a level of dethroning the English language. It requires like putting your brain to the side a little bit and feeling a bit more. It requires to like put your worldview to the side and be like, there are contexts and conditions that have framed the way I see the world, and there are contexts and conditions that I can learn about and become conscious of. So I'll come back with some examples, but with Araceli Camargo, like, steered the ship of this piece of work, and Abdi Hassan, Angela Camacho, Grace Carson, and Dr. Natalie Alassi Canales and myself came up with some principles for how to engage with this knowledge, and also a living encyclopedia of this knowledge system as it relates to urban systems and the built environment. So the 5 principles is kinship, which is about knowingness, it's about biodiversity, and it's about lived experience of the other than human kin as well, and the need for nourishment for the other than human kin. The second principle is nothing about us without us. So if any group are trying to implement some like really cool indigenous thing, just if there's no one in the room that can speak to that, that is like from that, then it's to really understand that those people need to be brought into the spaces, or the people that are in those design spaces need to like look outside of themselves and maybe pass the power of design on. The third is mutualistic symbiosis, which is about deep harmony and reciprocity. The fourth is love, and part of love is aliveness. And this is, I think, is like really important when we're thinking about the built environment, is that we think about buildings as inanimate objects. But there are so many lives that go into not just the building, but also the materials in the building. there's so much exploitation, there's so much extraction, there's so much corruption and lives lost in the process of building our buildings, both in the present moment and also in the futures to come. And it's to give that aliveness back to the places that we're living in. And the last one is dignity, and this speaks to Fazana's point about epistemic freedom, and it's about having the dignity of your imagination being included and actualized and materialized in the world around you. So these are the principles that we've been working with, and I thought I'd give you some examples of how I bring in Chinese ecological knowledges and traditional Chinese healing practices into my way of looking at urban systems and urban design. And it's to think about reframing what the body is. So in Chinese medicine, the body, because the skin is porous, the body includes the spaces around it. So when we're in this building, my body is the collective body of all of us. My body includes the building as well, and it includes the city that I'm in. If I'm walking in a woods, because of the exchange of the air that I'm breathing, because of my feet being on that earth, then my body is also the woods, and the woods is also my body as well. So bodies are processes of embodiment, and the body is a site of knowledge and of practice as well. And that from an ecological health perspective is that I cannot be well if the air is not well. I cannot be well if you are not well. So health is not some individual pursuit. It's done in community, it's done in practice, and it's like a constant dynamic process. And when I think about how this applies to urban systems and retrofit, is if we think about the essence of what retrofit is and what the need for retrofit is that there's a misalignment in form, in function, and in time. So we need to be moving like in relation to the times that we're in. And there's a saying in Chinese medicine that's you treat the person according to the time, according to the place, and according to the person. So if you're living, I don't know, your illness might be to do with the season that you're in, but it could also be to do with the times that you're living under, which is this world that we're all living in. It could also be the place. You might be living in a very damp place, but it could also be the earth that you're on, and it's your body in relation to all of these things. So health is not about not being sick. It's about being at one, and it's about being adaptable with the changes around you. And this requires a level of alignment and a consciousness of the potential that you have. And because in Chinese medicine, illness is caused by misalignment to time, place, and relation. So when we think about the body and we think about healing, it requires us to think with built environment professionals. It requires us to think in terms of like, where is the pavement? What material is the pavement made out of? And all of these things are really key to us even conceiving of what good health is. And feng shui is often seen as a really like spiritual, superstitious thing. But when we think about the feng shui of cities, and in ancient China, many cities were built according to the topography of the land. They were built facing certain directions because of prevailing winds. And there was a lot of like deep consciousness and knowledge of where you were. And you weren't just like building anywhere and maximizing use from anything. You were thinking about what was the climate, what was the geography, what was people's movement, and how can a space be adaptive to all of those things. And yeah, I just wanted to open up the possibility of retrofit and reimagining retrofit as being how do we think about form and function and time, but not just in our buildings, also in our relationships, also in our systems, and how can we think, how does changing the form improve the function, but also what does a change in function mean in our relationship to time? So there's lots that I can keep going on and on about, but I really encourage you to look on the traditional ecological knowledges on the Urban Health Council. They have a big Miro board that has all of these conversations on it. There's lots of audio reports. But yeah, really engage with the principles beforehand, and please come to that work with a lot of spaciousness if you can afford it, and a lot of receptivity.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Hannah. There was so much beauty in that. Thank you. I actually just received some text messages from Mara Jelly going, please shout out the link. She's doing such a good work. So Hannah was referring to, if you do remember this off the top of your head, urbanhealthcouncil.com. That's all one word. And then I think it's / if you go to reports, you'll see the access in the open access library of, I think there are 4 pieces of work related to that. So yeah, thank you for the incredible work you've done there. The shout-outs we're getting from it thus far are really inspiring. Less about us, though. There are a couple of things that you said that I think really fits into Seth and Akhil's, and I think there's talk that they're going to just kind of introduce. There was one part about the idea of like not being invited into a space, and in Elite Capture, Olufemi Taiwo talks about like the idea of deference politics and how to go into those environments when we're not actually allowed really to be in those environments. They're not designed for the conversations that we are trying to have. We become costumes, basically, for a show. And in that book, he talks about how the need to create epistemic authority was something that the residents of Flint, Michigan needed to do, and how they aligned themselves with different scientists and different groups, and how they created their own space in order to kind of carve their way out of this trouble when interfacing with the system in front of them was leading them to nowhere. And I guess there's a lot that you guys kind of do in that space about creating that infrastructure for discussion, for not just kind of imagining, but creating. And you create an infrastructure because many don't exist. And one of the ones you're doing right now is around materiality, these conversations and understanding how do we actually look at the materials of this built environment, and how do we kind of operate and work in this kind of false notion of a capitalist circular economy, and the kind of the messiness or the BS behind ESG frameworks and stuff like that. So I guess I'm going to kind of invite you to open up around that kind of topic of kind of creating these new rooms, these kind of existential rooms, and maybe if you want to focus on materiality to start, but I'll let you be free. It's your room.
I can do. Well done for tying those together. I was thinking to myself, like, oh, how's he going to do this? But I like that a lot. Maybe what I can do is like start by talking about a bit about our journey and how we arrived at this question of infrastructure, because as I said to Josh downstairs, like we're slightly new to maybe the room that we're in now, and I think that's maybe a skill that we've developed, or something that we're really interested in, is like how can we navigate some of these different disciplines to think about collective issues that we're all trying to overcome. So it's not about being kind of disciplined by the discipline, but it's about navigating and collaborating and working collectively. So we, in 2016, we started in an area that was hyper familiar to us in Brixton. And when you're from South London, Brixton is one of the kind of like pinnacles of your knowing. It's one of the pinnacles of London. It's like, Croydon, Brixton, that's about it. And we're really interested in how we can start to create spaces for communities like ourselves and marginalised communities to discuss topics, to imagine, to explore, to create, and to do that together. And that was, if anyone remembers 2016, hopefully it wasn't that too long ago, that was in the backdrop of kind of a recent wave of gentrification in Brixton. So there was no surprise that the conversations that we were having, a lot of them were about how we can create spaces for ourselves and the communities that we want to support. This was a kind of, we landed on this way of working, so Akhil, myself, and Gam, who we founded it with, we didn't really have kind of grand aspirations of developing a methodology and traveling across the country and working with local communities across the country. Actually, we were just really interested in how we can make space for these communities that we were a part of. But what we did was we stumbled upon something that was slightly interesting. We stumbled upon something that was also super fun as well. I think thinking about these processes as spaces that create joy is also really important. And what we did was we developed a methodology. So Akhil talks about using the site as a resource. We talk about working with local communities. We talk about valuing tacit knowledge. We did some more work in South London, but then we also developed a methodology that allowed us to travel across the country, to travel across Europe as well, and to think about how we can work hyper-locally and still try and kind of get over this question of creating space. A kind of spatial practice in urban environments are places that we kind of developed in. It's places that we learned a lot from. So we're really interested in creating space for these people. And then I think somewhere in about 2021, we stumbled upon a conversation with Imi and slightly with Fazana as well. There was conversations circling around. And what we were finding is that in this mission to create space, we'd actually adopted an approach that was probably more similar to like a professional services organization, to an architecture firm, to a kind of creative enterprise, something like that. And we were finding ourselves and our bodies exhausted by the work that we were doing. So we actually had to rethink our strategy. And I think that's where we started to visit this idea of creating infrastructures rather than just doing kind of project by project. And that's kind of where we are now. So what we really wanted to do is think about how can this method become a methodology to build new infrastructures for those communities, to build capacity within those communities, within young people, within people from marginalized communities, not just to kind of access the spaces that we are creating, but to imagine new spaces, to imagine new environments, to imagine new cities. And now we're trying to kind of figure out how we pave the way for those infrastructures to become reality.
So building onto that, I think a lot of it took a kind of reflection upon what some of the traits that we were doing that weren't being professionalized and how that worked. I mean, I find it really interesting that retrofit has become a kind of really professional term when like squatters have been retrofitting for a really long time. And we were on the tail end of that. And so as a group that was from a marginalized background, we were working, doing certain things. We couldn't afford space that we could pay for, but we could squat in spaces. And so that brought us across a number of different vacant spaces across London. We were in the Docks for a long time, in Custom House. We were in Poplar for a long time. We actually, one of the funnest places wasn't too far from here. It was an old building on Berkeley Square in Green Park, in Mayfair, right opposite Sexy Fish. And that was a fun place to be. And those spaces, because of the looseness of those spaces, they became these territories where we could invite other groups, other small groups, some of whom are still around now, some of whom aren't around anymore, and to let out that space as a type of infrastructure. The space was loose, it was porous in the same way that Hannah talks about the human body. And I think that that's an important part of how we think about reimagining or retrofitting a building. Is not just in the kind of the materiality of that building, which is something that we focus on, but actually about everything that happens around it, the capacity that you're able to build in the exchange of those materials, the capacities and the knowledges that you're able to share in the exchange of those things, because without that intangible exchange, it's kind of all for nothing. You know, we're in Croydon at the moment. I've mentioned this before, and if you're ever down in Croydon, you know, we'd love to have you. Outside of East Croydon Station are two of the tallest modular buildings in Europe. And these modular buildings shot very fast. Obviously, that's how modular buildings are. And it was these beacons of kind of new technology. When we think of technological progress, perhaps in an adverse way, it's like these two things are shining down or beaming down on Croydon. But beneath that and around that are young people who are the victims of knife crime. Beneath that and around that are people who are experiencing homelessness. Beneath that and around that are an array of different social issues that we are all stuck in. So there's a kind of attitude where it's like, all right, who gives a fuck about technological progression, right? Like, because if technology isn't progressing with us, then we'll find ourselves at the bottom of a barrel that may look as green as you like, it may look as retrofit as you like, it may look however you want it to be. And so we have always had to start at that. And that has sometimes been, because that is the baseline for a lot of our conversations, it means that, not in a derogatory way, our stuff is always low tech. Our stuff is always around something which is of an extraordinarily low resolution, a really base quality, you know. When we do exhibitions, when we do projects, sometimes you look at these things and you think, the fuck is that? Or you look at that thing and think, that doesn't look all that. And it's an experience that we've grown to love, because I think that unless we're using materiality, unless we're thinking about architecture and spaces as a way to challenge our assumption of what something should look like, I think it's very difficult to progress and to think about how things could look like. Today in Croydon, or at the moment in Croydon, we are experiencing a new kind of form of vacancy, and a lot of the commercial buildings in Croydon at the moment are vacant. The council, if anyone's from Croydon Council here, shout out, has gone bankrupt for the third time in 2 years. We've been joined by Birmingham City Council, which is news to everyone's ears, which was a good thing to hear. And so we're facing a kind of low point, a nadir, one of many nadirs, but we're facing a low point in Croydon. And now is the time, if ever, for radical thought about how we can approach these types of buildings. We work as an infrastructure for lots of other practices around us, and we've recently begun to formalize ways of funding and platforming those other practices as part of a formal infrastructure. We also do that with materials, so we bring it on, whenever we're producing projects, whenever we're producing exhibitions, we store those materials, we catalog those materials, we redistribute those materials, and that's something that's done at a very small scale, and I'll go into that mention of scale in a second as well. And so what we're trying to do is to think about how do we not scale up but retain this idea of a small scale? How do we formalize the small scale? And so we're trying to do at the moment is to raise money, to raise capital, for a material store within Croydon. We're interested in how we can take that argument around circularity, but position it within the base level I was talking about. How do we ground it within exactly where people are right now in Croydon Town Centre? What does that look? What is the material store that also builds the capacity of people to even think or imagine what retrofitted or a reimagined retrofitted future could be? What does that kind of look like? And so the first case scenario is how do we take on these vacant stores? And this is like level -1. So level -1 is that the land politics of Croydon is slightly different to the land politics of the rest of London. And it's very difficult to get your hands on a space in any meaningful way. And so one of those ways is which we create arguments around why we can have that space to retrofit while we have it as a meanwhile space. So we're trying to kind of change the terms of the clause of meanwhile space agreements in order to get into those spaces. The next is then to own the space and then to think about how one kind of purchase those spaces as well. Who do you appeal to as well? What kind of constellation of bad to good funders do you then reach out to do those things as well? Which is a messy process. There are some very messy people involved in that land tapestry in Croydon and in the rest of London, many of whom have to be engaged with. Many of whom don't believe what we believe, and many of whom do not want to be in the progressive future. Many of whom are not in that final picture, right? Many of whom are not in that final picture after the revolution. But there's a messiness to having to engage with those people. There's a messiness from having to be able to speak the language of those people, whilst always having that ability to co-conspire, whilst always knowing in your heart that these are not the people who will be there in the end. And it's a very difficult process that we find ourselves in. We find ourselves saying no a lot of the times, when sometimes in the back of my head I think maybe we should have just said yes. We find ourselves saying yes when sometimes we probably should have just said no. And so really like I think, if anything, our journey the hope in describing that part of our journey is to articulate what it means to be at stage -1 as an organisation of 6 people in the very peripheries of London who are working at this kind of within the kind of depths of the local. And I just want to end in about this question of scale, because this is something which I always have fun trying to address. We always have fun when we're trying to address, because we always work at such small scales. And when, not so many years ago, I used to be a maths tutor. And so that means that you're not that good at maths, but you're better at the kid that you're teaching. And I used to always, and as a way of explaining to young people that maths is just something that you can do. There's no such thing as being good at maths or being bad at maths. You can just do the maths, especially not to do your GCSEs. We used to do a little exercise which was proving that proving that 1 is actually 0.999 recurring. That the two things are exactly the same, right? And you would do that exercise by saying, if x equals 1, then let's take x as 1, and then we just divide it by, so x is 1, so it's 10 out of 10. You then take 10 out of 10, and you turn that into a fraction. But once you divide the fraction, you actually end up with 0.9999999 recurring. And that then equals to 1. And the kids will be like, wow, like, how is that even possible that these two things are the same? And it's because it's bullshit. And that's what you say, it's because it's actually fucking nonsense. And you are in control of that nonsense. That's at that point is when you say you're in control of the nonsense. I feel like we're the kids at this point. We're trying to grapple the nonsense, right? Especially in Croydon, we're trying to grapple the nonsense. But the belief that this is a construct, and the belief that, I think Scott said something about form following power in the last thing. I just caught that as I was going back. And I think the understanding that the forms that we inherit are just because of the power that forces those things to be, like, that is super inspiring. That really negates all of the bullshit, all of the really, really terrible things that are happening at the moment. And it allows us to think kind of really positively. So stay focused about this material store that's coming in Croydon. It's coming to a place near you. If anyone knows anyone with any money, you know where to go. We've got a PayPal account.
I can't follow that. There's nothing more I can say. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you, Fazana. Thank you, Akil. Thank you, Seth. This has been a pleasure for me. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. Give a round of applause to yourselves, because you made it all the way through as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you on behalf of all the organising partners. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who's joined us on the live stream. There are 3 more sites. There is an access fund to support your communities to be able to join us. You can come to Wales for a weekend. You can come to Bristol to be hosted by We Can Make. You can come to Glasgow. You can ask us to help programme things that you want to platform. You can ask us to connect you. You can ask us about what we want to do next. But for now, we just want to say a huge thank you to everyone all day on the live stream for bringing this bonkers vision to go around the country to life, and for just working with us in this building that has offered us lots of space and some contradictions and some challenges, and a real chance for us to intersect across many different knowledge systems, ideas and practices. And we'll hopefully see you on Friday the 6th of October in Knoll West, Bristol, starting the day in the factory, isn't it, Melissa? Is there anything you want to say to anyone about coming to Bristol?
Everyone's invited. Everyone's invited, and it's going to be a lot of hands-on stuff. We're working with soil, we're working with materials, we're going to be making a lot of stuff, so come play.
Awesome. Thank you once again. Follow the socials, follow the email follow-ups. There'll be lots of links, lots of next steps. Tell people who you think won't be in these spaces to come join us and speak to us about the Access Fund. Thank you, everyone. Big love. Thank you for closing us out. And if you have a couple of hands to offer, that will definitely help us all move out quickly. Much love. Thank you so much. Bye.